Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something appropriate about marking the present moment before we discuss what came before, long before any moment you or I could comprehend. This investigation concerns a question that Howard Phillips Lovecraft embedded into his fiction with such careful precision that it has haunted readers for nearly a century. Who worshipped Cthulhu before humans ever existed? The question itself is structured to unsettle, because it assumes facts that undermine everything we tell ourselves about our place in the cosmos. It presupposes that worship, that most distinctly conscious, purposeful act, occurred on this planet long before our species arrived to claim it as our own. It suggests that the gods, or things we might call gods, were never waiting for us, because others had already found them, served them, built temples to them in epochs so distant that geology itself struggles to name them. We will proceed systematically through 4 interconnected domains of inquiry. First, we examine the historical and philosophical contexts from which Lovecraft constructed this vision of pre-human civilizations. Second, we analyze the nature of these ancient worshippers and what their existence implies about cosmic order. Third, we trace their appearances across Lovecraft's interconnected narratives and the collaborative mythos that grew from his work. Finally, we assess how this concept has migrated beyond literature into our collective imagination, our archaeology, our nightmares. By the end, you may find yourself looking at human history differently, not as the story of civilization's rise, but as a brief interruption in a much older pattern of devotion. Howard Phillips Lovecraft composed The Call of Cthulhu during the summer of 1926, and the story appeared in the February 1928 issue of Weird Tales magazine. This was not simply another contribution to the pulp horror market that sustained him financially throughout his career. The story represented a crystallization of ideas Lovecraft had been developing for years about humanity's place in a cosmos that preceded us and would persist long after our extinction. In his voluminous correspondence, Lovecraft wrote an estimated 100,000 letters during his lifetime. He explicitly articulated his intention to subvert the anthropocentric assumptions that dominated both religious thought and even scientific narratives of his era. Where Christianity placed humanity at the center of divine concern, and where even secular narratives often implied human consciousness as the universe's inevitable culmination, Lovecraft constructed something far more unsettling. His pre-human worshippers served a specific philosophical function. They provided tangible proof, embedded in fictional archaeology, that consciousness and civilization had flourished on Earth millions or billions of years before Homo sapiens emerged, and that these earlier intelligences had already discovered, named, and worshipped the entities we foolishly think we are encountering for the first time. The creative period between 1926 and 1931 saw Lovecraft working through the implications of geological deep time with almost obsessive focus. His commonplace book, a notebook where he recorded story ideas and atmospheric fragments, contains dozens of entries referencing sunken cities, ancient manuscripts, and civilizations that rose and fell before human memory began. Entry 103 reads simply, Ancient Ruin in Africa, Doran Cliff, Legends of Bedged, Terrible Rites. Entry 139 mentions pre-human idol found in desert ruins. These were not random imaginative exercises, but components of a systematic mythology constructed to demonstrate human irrelevance. Consider the precision with which Lovecraft dated these civilizations, not thousands of years ago, which might allow human memory to touch them through distorted legends, but millions or billions of years into a past where human existence becomes not merely unlikely, but temporally impossible. This was deliberate strategy. By placing his pre-human worshippers beyond the reach of even distorted historical memory, Lovecraft ensured that their discovery would constitute an epistemological crisis rather than an archaeological curiosity. Lovecraft's atheism met geological science in these stories to produce something neither camp anticipated. He had rejected the supernatural claims of Christianity by his teenage years, but unlike many rationalists of his era, he found no comfort in scientific materialism. The geology and paleontology of the late 19th and early 20th centuries revealed a cosmos of staggering age, yes, but also one of cosmic indifference. Charles Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism, published in his Principles of Geology between 1830 and 1833, had already established that Earth operated according to slow, grinding processes over unimaginable timescales. By Lovecraft's era, the age of the Earth was estimated at billions of years, a figure that made human history an invisible sliver at the very end of an incomprehensible timeline. What Lovecraft understood, and what his pre-human worshippers dramatized, was that deep time destroyed not only religious certainty, but also the narrative of progress. If intelligence had arisen before us, if civilizations had built cities and developed sciences and worshipped their gods, and then fallen into extinction, leaving barely a trace, then what guarantee did we have that our trajectory would differ? The pre-human worshippers were not simply a horror story device. They were a philosophical argument rendered as fiction. We must recognize here that Lovecraft drew upon specific esoteric traditions even as he inverted their meanings. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky, had popularized the concept of root races, successive waves of human or proto-human civilizations that rose and fell across vast epochs. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, described Atlantis and Lemuria as literal historical civilizations whose descendants allegedly survived into the modern era. These were meant as spiritually elevating narratives, suggesting that hidden wisdom persisted from ancient times, and that human consciousness was evolving toward higher states. Lovecraft appropriated the structure, ancient civilizations separated by catastrophic gaps, but stripped away all spiritual comfort. His pre-human races did not represent stages in human evolution or repositories of wisdom awaiting rediscovery. They represented entirely separate evolutionary lines, non-human intelligences whose very existence proved that consciousness was not humanity's unique gift, but a common cosmic accident that had occurred repeatedly on this one planet alone. Where theosophy offered continuity and hope, Lovecraft offered discontinuity and cosmic irrelevance. The function of these pre-human worshippers within Lovecraft's broader project cannot be overstated. They provided what we might call internal verification for his mythology, the sense that the Cthulhu cult, the Necronomicon, the sunken city of R'lyeh, all possessed histories that extended far beyond the stories in which they appeared. When Inspector Legros raids a cult gathering in the Louisiana Bayou in 1908 within the Call of Cthulhu, and the captured cultists describe traditions handed down from the old ones, Lovecraft is not depicting a human religious innovation. He is suggesting that human cultists are merely the most recent link in a chain of worship stretching back through geological epochs. The chant Fung Lui Magluanaf Cthulhu Relia Ugahanagul Ftagen becomes more disturbing when we recognize it as supposedly pre-linguistic, a formula that was ancient when humanity's ancestors still lived in trees, preserved not through writing, but through some darker mode of transmission. This is not worship as we understand it, as a relationship between creature and creator, mediated by moral law. This is worship as instinctive response to overwhelming power, a pattern that emerges whenever consciousness encounters something too vast to comprehend. Lovecraft's creative achievement, then, was constructing a fictional archaeology detailed enough to produce the psychological effect of authenticity. He dated his stories precisely, referenced academic journals that did not exist, quoted from manuscripts that were never written, and described artifacts that were never carved. Yet he did so with such internal consistency that readers found themselves half believing that somewhere, in some museum basement or private collection, these proofs might actually exist. The pre-human worshippers served as the foundation for this elaborate hoax because they explained how forbidden knowledge could persist, not through human transmission, which could be traced and verified, but through direct encounter with objects and texts created by non-human hands. We are not meant to trust the cultist's testimony or the scholar's interpretations. We are meant to trust the geological record itself, which Lovecraft manipulates to suggest gaps, extinction events, submerged continents, polar catastrophes, during which anything might have risen and fallen without leaving evidence our methods could recognize. This brings us necessarily to examine the cultural and philosophical antecedents that made such a vision possible. The conceptual architecture that allowed Lovecraft to imagine pre-human civilizations worshipping cosmic entities was constructed throughout the 19th century by geologists, biologists, and popular writers who collectively dismantled humanity's assumed centrality in both time and space. The key transformation began with the work of James Hutton, whose theory of the Earth, 1795, proposed that geological processes operated over timescales vastly exceeding biblical chronology, and Charles Lyell, whose Principles of Geology, 1830-1833, provided empirical evidence for these claims. Before these works, educated Europeans generally accepted Archbishop James Ussher's 1650 calculation that Earth was created in 4004 BCE, a timeline that made human history coterminous with planetary history itself. Lyell's uniformitarianism revealed something far more unsettling, that Earth had existed for millions of years before humans appeared, and that the geological record contained evidence of repeated catastrophic extinctions, erasing entire ecosystems. This was the intellectual soil in which Lovecraft's pre-human worshippers would eventually take root. If the planet had existed for incomprehensible ages before humanity, and if life itself had taken radically different forms during those epochs, then consciousness too might have emerged in shapes and species we could barely recognize, let alone understand. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, extended this temporal revolution into biology, demonstrating that species were not fixed categories, but temporary adaptations in an endless process of variation and selection. The philosophical implications rippled far beyond natural history. If humans were simply one species among millions, distinguished by intelligence, but not exempt from extinction, then human purposes and human meanings possessed no cosmic endorsement. Darwin himself recognized the disturbing implications, writing in an 1860 letter that there is grandeur in this view of life, but the grandeur was cold and impersonal, the beauty of a mechanism that operated without intention or mercy. Lovecraft absorbed this lesson thoroughly. His pre-human civilizations, the elder things who arrived on Earth 1 billion years ago, the great race of Yith who inhabited cone-shaped bodies 50 million years in our past, the civilizations that built Relaya before continental drift assumed its current configuration, all dramatize the Darwinian insight that intelligence is not humanity's unique possession, but a survival strategy that has been deployed and abandoned countless times across Earth's history. What makes this specifically Lovecraftian rather than merely Darwinian is the addition of worship. These intelligences did not simply exist and then go extinct. They encountered entities so powerful and so incomprehensible that worship became the only rational response. We must pause here to consider how late Victorian and Edwardian occultism provided both structure and terminology for these speculations, even as Lovecraft rejected occultism's spiritual claims. The Theosophical Society's teachings about Atlantis and Lemuria were not fringe beliefs in the 1890s and early 1900s, but widely discussed alternative histories that appeared in respectable publications. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, 1882, sold thousands of copies and proposed that Plato's Atlantis was literally real, an advanced civilization destroyed by geological catastrophe, whose survivors spread across the globe, explaining supposed similarities between ancient cultures. Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, went further, describing a succession of root races, Lemurians, Atlanteans, and others, who possessed sciences and spiritual knowledge, now lost to degraded modern humanity. These narratives shared a common structure. They posited ancient civilizations vastly superior to known historical cultures. They explained their disappearance through catastrophes preserved in distorted myths, and they suggested that fragments of their knowledge survived in occult traditions and mysterious artifacts. Lovecraft appropriated this entire framework, but inverted its emotional valence. Where theosophists found spiritual elevation in ancient wisdom, Lovecraft found horror in ancient worship of entities that regarded all consciousness, Lemurian or human, with equal indifference. The literary precursors who most directly influenced Lovecraft's vision of pre-human civilizations wrote in the decades immediately before his career began. Arthur Machen's The Novel of the Black Seal, 1895, introduced the concept of little people, not charming folklore fairies, but degraded survivors of a pre-human or proto-human race that once dominated Britain and now persisted in hidden valleys, worshipping ancient gods through unspeakable rites. Malkin's innovation was treating British folklore as corrupted memories of actual non-human or pre-human inhabitants, a technique Lovecraft would adopt and expand. William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland, 1908, presented a vision of deep time that directly anticipated Lovecraft's methods. A manuscript describing encounters with cosmic entities across millions of years, revealed through psychic visions that transcend normal temporal boundaries. Hodgson's swine creatures, which emerge from an abyss to worship nameless powers, provided a template for Lovecraft's notion that worship of the Old Ones manifested across different epochs in different biological forms. Edgar Allan Poe's MS Found in a Bottle, 1833, and A Descent into the Maelstrom, 1841, established the narrative technique of the discovered manuscript, revealing impossible knowledge, while his unfinished novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, 1838, suggested ancient civilizations in Antarctica, a motif Lovecraft would develop fully in At the Mountains of Madness, 1931. What unified these literary precursors was a shared fascination with what we might call archaeological horror, the notion that excavation and discovery do not lead to knowledge and progress, but to encounters with truths that undermine the excavator's sanity and worldview. This represented a significant departure from earlier Gothic fiction, which typically located horror in medieval castles, ancestral curses, and relatively recent pasts. The new horror of the late 19th century looked deeper, to pre-Christian paganisms, to geological strata beneath known civilizations, to evolutionary pasts where human ancestors shared the world with creatures that challenged the category of human itself. British imperialism played a complex role in this development, as European powers excavated ancient sites in Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and elsewhere. They encountered civilizations whose antiquity and sophistication disturbed assumptions about Western progress and racial superiority. The response was often to mystify these civilizations, to attribute their achievements to lost continents or extraterrestrial intervention, rather than acknowledge the continuity of human intelligence across cultures. Lovecraft inherited this problematic discourse. His racism is well documented and undeniable, but transformed it into something stranger. His pre-human worshippers were not displaced racial anxieties, but genuine non-humans, creatures that made all human distinctions irrelevant by revealing that consciousness itself, in any form, was cosmically insignificant. The period between 1890 and 1926, when Lovecraft wrote The Call of Cthulhu, also witnessed the birth of modern archaeology as a scientific discipline, and with it came disturbing discoveries that seemed to validate speculative fiction's darkest imaginings. The excavation of Pompeii revealed a city frozen in the moment of catastrophe, its inhabitants preserved in poses of terror. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy, 1870s, and Mycenae, 1876, proved that Homer's epics contained traces of historical reality, suggesting that other myths might encode actual events. Arthur Evans's discovery of the Minoan civilization on Crete, 1900-1905, revealed a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that had vanished so completely that even Greek classical authors preserved only garbled legends about it. Each discovery reinforced the same unsettling pattern. Civilizations rose to remarkable heights, then collapsed so thoroughly that only fragments remained, and these fragments were often misinterpreted or absorbed into later mythologies without understanding. Lovecraft's fictional archaeology followed these patterns precisely. His pre-human civilizations left behind cyclopean ruins, undecipherable manuscripts, and idol statues that later human cultures encountered and incorporated into their own religious systems without comprehending their true origin or meaning. The worship of Cthulhu by human cultists in this framework represents cargo cult behavior, ritualized imitation of practices whose original context and purpose have been lost to time. This brings us to a crucial recognition. Lovecraft's pre-human worshippers were not simply imaginative creations, but synthesized responses to genuine intellectual and cultural anxieties of his era. The late 19th and early 20th centuries destabilized human temporal identity in ways we still struggle to process. Deep time stretched the past beyond comprehension. Evolutionary theory removed divine purpose from biological development. Archaeological discoveries revealed that civilizational collapse was the norm rather than the exception. Occult speculation filled the resulting void with ancient wisdom narratives that provided meaning. But Lovecraft saw through this consolation to the darker implication: if others had come before us, achieved consciousness and civilization, and then vanished, leaving barely a trace, then we too were temporary, our achievements ephemeral, our worship of gods, of science, of progress, merely instinctive responses to powers we could not comprehend and that did not care whether we worshipped or not. The specific names and rituals Lovecraft invented would prove less important than this existential structure, which has continued to resonate precisely because it articulates an anxiety that predated his fiction and persists long after. The name Cthulhu itself functions as Lovecraft's most elegant demonstration of pre-human worship because it presents itself as fundamentally unpronounceable by human vocal apparatus. In The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft describes the name as only approximately rendered in human phonetics, writing that it would be pronounced Cthulhu, or perhaps Cthulhu F-O-Chtan, with the warning that the first word was supposed to be Cthulhu, though they could not say it. This is not merely atmospheric decoration, but a sophisticated linguistic argument embedded in horror fiction. If the name cannot be pronounced correctly by human mouths, then it was never meant for human mouths. It originated with beings whose vocal anatomy, whose very physical structure, differed fundamentally from our own. The implication is precise and disturbing. We are attempting to worship using a liturgy designed for throats, tongues, and palates that do not resemble ours, speaking syllables our species was never meant to speak. This transforms every human utterance of Cthulhu into evidence of our second-hand relationship to these entities, proof that we are inheritors of worship practices rather than their originators. Lovecraft's approach to linguistic impossibility drew upon early 20th century awareness of how profoundly language shapes and limits thought. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, developed by linguists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf in the 1920s and 1930s, contemporaneous with Lovecraft's mature work, proposed that the structure of a language fundamentally influences its speaker's cognition and worldview. While academic linguists debated the strong and weak forms of this hypothesis, Lovecraft pursued its horror implications. If language shapes thought, then languages designed for non-human cognition would encode concepts literally unthinkable for humans. The chant, Fanglui Maglunaf, Cthulhu Rulia, Gahnagel Vtagen, exemplifies this principle. Lovecraft provides a translation. In his house at Rulia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. But the translation is suspiciously neat, suspiciously comprehensible. The dissonance between the alien phonetics and the mundane English gloss suggests that something crucial is being lost or distorted in translation, that the actual meaning exists in dimensions of significance our linguistic categories cannot capture. This is pre-linguistic ritual formula in the most literal sense, language that predates human language, preserved across epochs, not through understanding, but through rote repetition by worshippers who, like us, can only approximate what they are saying. The name Rulia, the sunken city where Cthulhu lies entombed, operates through similar principles of linguistic alienation. Lovecraft describes its architecture as non-Euclidean, a geometric descriptor that he uses to suggest something more profound than unusual angles. Euclidean geometry, formalized by the Greek mathematician Euclid around 300 BCE, describes the spatial relationships that human perception evolved to navigate, parallel lines that never meet, angles that sum to 180 degrees in triangles, three-dimensional space that follows predictable rules. Non-Euclidean geometries, developed by mathematicians like Nikolai Lobachevsky and Bernhard Riemann in the 19th century, describe spaces where these intuitive rules break down, surfaces of constant negative or positive curvature, spaces where parallel lines converge or diverge, dimensions beyond the three we directly perceive. When Lovecraft describes R'lyeh as non-Euclidean, he is not simply indicating strange architecture, but suggesting that the city was designed for consciousness that perceives space differently than humans do. The pre-human worshippers who built or inhabited R'lyeh possessed sensory apparatus and cognitive categories fundamentally alien to ours, and the city's geometry reflects their perceptual reality, not ours. To enter R'lyeh is to enter a space designed for minds that are not human minds, to navigate according to principles that evolution never prepared us to comprehend. Consider the symbolic function of these unpronounceable names and impossible geometries within Lovecraft's broader mythology. They establish a hierarchy of linguistic and spatial access that places humanity firmly in the subordinate position. The Old Ones, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, and their kin, possess names that resist human phonetics. The cities they inhabit, or the places they occupy, follow geometric principles beyond human intuition. The texts that describe them, like the Necronomicon and the Pnakotic manuscripts, are written in languages that drive translators mad through the very act of comprehension. This systematic inaccessibility serves a specific philosophical purpose. It demonstrates that these entities and their worship existed in a semiotic system entirely independent of humanity. We are not the intended audience for these names, these chants, these architectural arrangements. We are, at best, eavesdroppers who have stumbled upon communications never meant for us, and our attempts to participate in the worship these systems encode mark us as cargo cultists, imitating behaviors we cannot truly understand. The pre-human worshippers, the elder things, the deep ones, the civilizations that rose and fell before Homo sapiens emerged, possessed the cognitive and physical apparatus to engage with these names and spaces directly without the mediating distortion that human limitations impose. The famous chant deserves closer analysis as a masterpiece of constructed meaninglessness that somehow conveys profound dread. Fenglui Molunaf, Cthulhu, R'lyeh Wuganagal Ftang contains no recognizable morphemes from any human language family, yet Lovecraft structures it with apparent grammar. Proper nouns, Cthulhu, R'lyeh, embedded in what seem to be verbal and prepositional constructions. The apostrophes scattered throughout suggest glottal stops or other phonemic features common in languages like Arabic or Hawaiian, but alien to English phonology. The consonant clusters, MGOW, Wugahnagal, require vocal gymnastics that English speakers find almost physically painful to attempt. This is deliberate design. Lovecraft is forcing readers to experience in miniature what it would mean to use a language that evolved for non-human purposes. The discomfort of pronunciation becomes a bodily argument. Your mouth was not meant to make these sounds because your species was not meant to speak this language. When human cultists chant these words in Lovecraft's stories, they are engaging in what linguists might call phonetic mimicry without semantic comprehension. They can approximate the sounds, but the actual meaning, the conceptual weight these syllables carry in their original context, remains forever beyond human cognitive reach. We must recognize that Lovecraft's linguistic strategies parallel developments in modernist literature and early anthropology that were occurring simultaneously. James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, 1939, though begun in the 1920s, experimented with portmanteau words and multilingual puns that resisted stable meaning, creating a text that could be read but never fully understood. Anthropologists like Bronisław Malinowski, working in the Trobriand Islands in the 1910s, were documenting how profoundly language embedded culture-specific concepts that could not be cleanly translated into European languages. Lovecraft took these insights in a darker direction. If human languages already contain concepts opaque to outsiders, then genuinely non-human languages would contain concepts fundamentally unthinkable for humans. The pre-human worshippers did not simply speak different languages. They thought in categories our neurology cannot support. Their worship of Cthulhu was not the worship of subjects toward a deity, but something stranger, a relationship that our vocabulary of worship can only approximate, the way a child's drawing approximates a photograph. The theological and philosophical precision they brought to their devotion exists on the other side of a cognitive barrier we cannot cross. The symbolic language extends beyond phonetics into what we might call material semiotics, the way objects and artifacts function as texts in Lovecraft's mythology. The Cthulhu idols discovered in Louisiana and Greenland in the Call of Cthulhu are described as roughly carved from greenish stone, depicting a pulpy, tentacled head surmounting a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. These idols function as three-dimensional writing systems, encoding information in their form rather than through inscribed symbols. But they are degraded copies, sculptures created by human cultists who work from dreams and visions rather than direct observation. The original idols, we are led to believe, were created by the pre-human worshippers who had actual contact with Cthulhu or his starspawn, and those original artifacts would encode information in their proportions, their angles, their material composition, in ways that the human reproductions can only dimly approximate. Every human religious object connected to the Cthulhu mythos becomes, in this framework, a corrupted text, a document that has been translated through too many intermediate steps, each translation introducing distortions and losses until the connection to the original meaning grows tenuous. This is worship as broken telephone across geological epochs, with each iteration of believers more distant from the source, more uncertain about what they are actually doing or why. This brings us to a final crucial observation about Lovecraft's symbolic language. It functions through absence rather than presence, through what cannot be said rather than what can. The most important concepts in his mythology, what Cthulhu actually is, what the old ones want, what awakening them would truly mean, are never directly articulated, but only gestured toward through inadequate human metaphors. Characters describe indescribable horrors, invoke nameless fears, witness unmentionable rites. This is not simply failure of craft, but careful rhetorical strategy. By insisting that the most significant elements resist language entirely, Lovecraft creates a vacuum, that each reader fills with their own deepest anxieties. The pre-human worshippers supposedly possess languages adequate to these realities, but those languages are lost to us, and with them, any possibility of precise understanding. We are left with fragments, approximations, names we cannot pronounce, and geometries we cannot navigate, all pointing toward worship practices and theological concepts that existed before our species arrived to misinterpret them. The symbolic language of the Cthulhu mythos is thus a language of systematic inadequacy, designed to convince us that we are using the wrong tools to describe the wrong objects in pursuit of knowledge we are constitutionally incapable of achieving, and that others, long extinct, once possessed the right tools, the right concepts, the right relationship to entities we can barely acknowledge exist. Lovecraft's greatest technical achievement was constructing a fictional mythology detailed enough to produce what we might call the documentary effect, the unsettling sense that these stories document rather than invent, that they reveal rather than create. This required systematic techniques of authentication borrowed from academic writing, journalism, and historical scholarship, all deployed in service of making the impossible seems merely improbable. The method appears most clearly in his treatment of forbidden texts, particularly the Necronomicon, which he invented in his 1924 story, The Hound, and subsequently referenced across dozens of stories with such careful consistency that readers regularly inquired about where they might obtain copies. Lovecraft described the Necronomicon as written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in Damascus around 730 CE, translated into Greek in 950 CE by Theodorus Philetus, then into Latin in 1228 by Olaus Wormius, with only 5 copies of the Latin text surviving into the modern era, located in the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Widener Library at Harvard University, the University of Buenos Aires, and 1 private collection. This level of bibliographic specificity, real institutions housing a non-existent text, blurs the boundary between fiction and scholarship so effectively that it constitutes a form of literary gaslighting. The Pnakotic manuscripts serve an even more crucial function in establishing pre-human worship as fact rather than speculation within the internal logic of Lovecraft's mythology. First mentioned in Polaris, 1918, and developed more fully in The Other Gods, 1921, and later stories, the Pnakotic manuscripts are described as predating human civilization entirely. Unlike the Necronomicon, which is a human text about non-human entities, the Pnakotic manuscripts supposedly originate with the great race of Yith or other pre-human intelligences, containing knowledge transcribed directly by non-human scribes. Lovecraft dates them to more than 1 million years ago in some references, placing them in epochs when Homo sapiens did not exist. The genius of this construction is that it provides an in-universe explanation for how knowledge of pre-human worship could survive to the present, not through human oral tradition or archaeological discovery alone, but through actual documents created by the pre-human worshippers themselves, preserved in hidden libraries and subsequently discovered by human scholars. When characters in Lovecraft's stories consult the Pnakotic manuscripts, they are supposedly reading primary sources from civilizations that flourished and fell millions of years before human history began. This invests the worship of Cthulhu with a documentary weight that purely invented lore could never achieve. Lovecraft reinforced this documentary effect through strategic use of the unreliable artifact, objects that cannot be conclusively dated or explained through conventional means, suggesting origins that exceed scientific methodology's reach. The Cthulhu idol, discovered in Louisiana, examined by Professor Webb of Princeton in The Call of Cthulhu, exemplifies this technique. Lovecraft describes Webb as analyzing the hieroglyphics on the idol's base, determining that they resemble no known writing system, and dating the stone itself as impossibly ancient through unspecified geological means. The idol thus becomes unfalsifiable. It exists within the story as a physical object examined by credentialed experts, yet its properties systematically resist the very methodologies that would normally authenticate or debunk such artifacts. We are told enough to believe it could be real. A professor at a real university using real scientific techniques, but not so much that we could verify the specific claims. This parallels how actual hoaxes function. The Cardiff Giant, the Piltdown Man, and other fraudulent archaeological discoveries succeeded temporarily by providing just enough pseudo-scientific detail to satisfy non-expert audiences while avoiding sufficient specificity to allow expert verification. Lovecraft was essentially creating literary hoaxes, artifacts that functioned as evidence within his fictional frame, but that readers could never quite disprove because they existed in a carefully maintained space between the verifiable and the fantastic. Consider how Lovecraft's technique evolved through his collaborative relationships with other writers in the Weird Tales circle during the late 1920s and early 1930s. When Robert E. Howard referenced the Necronomicon in his 1931 story, The Children of the Night, and when Clark Ashton Smith mentioned Tsathoggua, a Lovecraft creation, in his Hyperborean stories, these cross-references created what literary theorists call intertextual density, the sense that multiple independent sources corroborate the same underlying reality. This was not accidental, but deliberately cultivated through correspondence, in which Lovecraft actively encouraged other writers to borrow his invented mythology. In a 1930 letter to Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft wrote, "You are welcome to use any of my inventions, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, the Necronomicon, etc., in your stories, and I shall take the liberty of using any of yours that appeal to me." This collaborative world-building produced something unprecedented in pulp fiction, a shared mythology that appeared to have independent existence beyond any single author's imagination. When readers encountered references to Cthulhu or the Necronomicon across stories by different authors in different issues of Weird Tales, the cumulative effect suggested not coordination, but discovery, as if these writers were independently accessing genuine forbidden knowledge rather than passing around fictional inventions. The pseudo-documentary style extended to Lovecraft's careful manipulation of narrative framing and temporal distance. Many of his stories employ what we might call the discovered manuscript structure. The Call of Cthulhu is presented as the notes of a recently deceased academic whose investigation into mysterious cults led him to forbidden knowledge. The Shadow Out of Time frames itself as the memoir of an economics professor whose mind was displaced across time. At the Mountains of Madness takes the form of a scientific report by an Antarctic explorer warning future expeditions away from certain regions. These framing devices create multiple layers of attestation. We are not simply reading Lovecraft's fiction, but supposedly reading documents created by fictional characters who themselves investigated evidence of pre-human civilizations. Each layer of mediation adds apparent authenticity. The technique mirrors how actual historical knowledge reaches us, not through direct access to events, but through documents created by witnesses, which are then interpreted by later scholars, each interpretive layer adding both detail and distortion. By mimicking this structure, Lovecraft made his pre-human worshippers feel like historical realities recovered through scholarly investigation rather than imaginative inventions. We must recognize, however, that Lovecraft's myth-building contained a fundamental ambiguity that he never fully resolved, and that subsequent writers have interpreted in contradictory ways. The question is this: did Lovecraft intend his mythology to have internal consistency, or was each story a separate thought experiment that reimagined the underlying concepts? Evidence exists for both interpretations. On one hand, he maintained careful continuity in his correspondence and encouraged other writers to observe that continuity, suggesting he conceived of the Cthulhu mythos as a coherent universe with stable rules. On the other hand, he wrote in a 1933 letter that all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large, which implies that each story explores this premise without necessarily connecting to the others as chapters in a single narrative. This ambiguity becomes crucial when we consider pre-human worship specifically. Are the elder things, the great race of Yith, the deep ones, and other pre-human civilizations meant to coexist in a single timeline, or are they alternative imaginings of what pre-human intelligence might look like? Lovecraft's own writings provide evidence for both readings, and this productive ambiguity has allowed later writers and game designers to systematize his mythology in ways he never explicitly authorized, but also never prevented. The most revealing aspect of Lovecraft's myth-building technique is how he deployed strategic vagueness about chronology and causation while maintaining precise detail about peripheral elements. He tells us exactly where the 5 surviving Latin copies of the Necronomicon are housed, but remains deliberately unclear about what the book actually says in detail. He describes the bas-reliefs in the Antarctic city with geological and artistic precision in At the Mountains of Madness, but leaves the ultimate fate of the elder things ambiguous. He provides dates: 1 billion years ago, 50 million years in the past, but these figures are so vast that they effectively communicate unimaginably ancient rather than functioning as precise historical markers. This combination of peripheral precision and central vagueness is masterful rhetorical strategy. The precise details about library locations, stone composition, and architectural measurements create a surface of authenticity that readers accept, and this acceptance then extends, almost unconsciously, to the vague claims about cosmic entities and pre-human worship that those details supposedly support. It is the technique of the confidence artist. Establish credibility through verifiable or plausible small claims, then leverage that credibility to sell the large claim that cannot be verified. The result of these accumulated techniques, invented texts with bibliographic histories, cross-author corroboration, pseudo-documentary framing, strategic vagueness balanced with peripheral precision, is that Lovecraft created something unprecedented in genre fiction. His mythology did not simply provide a setting for horror stories, but constructed what philosophers might call an alternate epistemology, a system for generating knowledge, claims that mimicked academic discourse while leading to conclusions academic discourse would never endorse. When a Lovecraft character consults the narcotic manuscripts and learns about pre-human civilizations worshipping Cthulhu, the reader is meant to experience this as research rather than invention, as historical discovery rather than imaginative creation. The pre-human worshippers gain their power over the imagination, not because they are well described. Lovecraft is often maddeningly vague about what they actually looked like or did, but because they are well documented within the fictional frame, supported by layers of apparent evidence that function like historical sources even as they describe the impossible. This brings us necessarily to examine the nature of these worshippers themselves and what their existence implies about cosmic order, consciousness, and the meaning or meaninglessness of devotion across geological time. The existence of pre-human worshippers in Lovecraft's mythology systematically undermines three foundational assumptions that structure human self-understanding: our significance in cosmic history, our uniqueness as conscious beings, and our agency in shaping meaning through belief and ritual. We might call this temporal vertigo, the disorienting recognition that human civilization represents not the culmination of planetary history, but a brief interruption in patterns that preceded us and will continue after our extinction. When Inspector Legrasse's cultists in The Call of Cthulhu chant formulas handed down from frightful antiquity, they are not innovating new religious expressions, but mechanically repeating syllables whose original meaning was established by non-human intelligences millions of years before Homo sapiens emerged from the African savanna. This temporal displacement is not metaphorical, but literal within Lovecraft's fictional framework. Consciousness arose on Earth, developed civilization, encountered cosmic entities worthy of worship, and then went extinct, leaving behind only fragmentary records and degraded traditions that later humans would mistake for their own innovations. The philosophical implication is devastating. Even our gods are not ours. Our deepest religious impulses are borrowed, and our sense of participating in something transcendent is actually participation in something profoundly secondhand. This leads directly to what we might term worship without meaning, religious behavior divorced from the moral and teleological frameworks that usually justify devotion. Human religions typically construct worship as a relationship between creature and creator, between the faithful and the divine, mediated by concepts like love, justice, covenant, or karmic law. The God of Abraham rewards righteousness and punishes sin. The Buddhist Dharma offers liberation through correct understanding and practice. Even polytheistic pantheons like those of Greece or Rome involve gods who care, however capriciously, about human affairs and whose worship brings tangible or spiritual benefits. Cthulhu offers no such relationship. The pre-human civilizations that worshipped him did not do so because he loved them, guided them, or promised them salvation. They worshipped because they encountered power so overwhelming that worship became an instinctive response, the behavioral equivalent of an animal freezing when confronted by a predator too large to fight or flee. Lovecraft describes this explicitly in The Call of Cthulhu when he writes that the cultists worship not from any idea of morals or justice, but merely because of the thing's power. This is worship stripped of every comforting theological assumption, reduced to its most primitive core. acknowledgement of superior force without hope of reciprocity or redemption. The concept of cyclic apocalypse provides the temporal structure within which pre-human worship operates in Lovecraft's mythology. The most famous couplet in all cosmic horror literature appears in The Nameless City, 1921. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. This formulation, attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in the fictional Necronomicon, articulates a vision of time as circular rather than linear, where extinction is temporary and return is inevitable. The pre-human civilizations rose, worshipped the old ones, and then fell, but the old ones themselves did not die. Cthulhu lies dreaming in Arclia, described as dead but dreaming in the cultist's chant, existing in a state that our categories of life and death cannot adequately capture. The implication is that pre-human worship did not end with the extinction of the pre-human worshippers, but merely paused, waiting for the next iteration of conscious life to arise and resume the patterns. Human cultists who worship Cthulhu are not innovating but resuming, not discovering but remembering through some mechanism, dreams, genetic memory, psychic residue that Lovecraft never fully explains, because explanation would diminish the horror of inevitability. We're not choosing to worship. We are being drawn back into worship patterns established long before choice existed. Archaeological horror emerges as the practical consequence of this cosmic structure. Every excavation, every exploration of deep places, every scholarly investigation into ancient texts and artifacts carries the risk of awakening what should remain undisturbed. This inverts the Enlightenment narrative of knowledge as power and progress. In the conventional scientific worldview, archaeology recovers lost knowledge, expanding human understanding and cultural heritage. In Lovecraft's counter-narrative, archaeology risks recovering knowledge that erases human understanding and reveals cultural heritage as cosmically insignificant. The Antarctic expedition in At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, discovers the preserved city of the Elder Things and learns that these beings arrived on Earth 1 billion years ago, created complex civilizations, and left behind records of their conflicts with Cthulhu's Starspawn and other pre-human entities. This knowledge does not empower the expedition's members, but destroys them. One member goes mad, others die in horrible ways, and the narrator, Professor Dyer, can only warn future expeditions to stay away, to leave the ancient city unexamined. The message is clear. Some knowledge should remain buried, not because it is false, but because human consciousness cannot integrate it without shattering. We must pause here to recognize how Lovecraft's treatment of pre-human worship engages with and inverts contemporary philosophical movements, particularly the pragmatism of William James and John Dewey that dominated American philosophy during Lovecraft's lifetime. Pragmatism argued that beliefs should be evaluated by their consequences, their utility in helping humans navigate experience and solve problems. Religious beliefs in this framework are true insofar as they produce beneficial effects, comfort, community, moral guidance, meaning. Lovecraft's cosmic horror asks, what if the most useful belief that human consciousness matters, that our purposes have significance, that worship connects us to something greater, is false? What if the truth is that consciousness has arisen multiple times on Earth in multiple forms, that all previous instances worshipped entities that did not care about them, and that these entities still exist, waiting for astronomical alignments that will allow them to return and resume relationships with worshippers who mean nothing to them. This is pragmatism's nightmare scenario, a truth so devastating that believing it offers no utility, only despair, yet a truth nonetheless. The pre-human worshippers serve as proof that this nightmare scenario is, within Lovecraft's mythology, the actual state of affairs. The concept of precedent terror completes this philosophical framework. This is not simply the fear of what came before us, but the specific horror of recognizing that others faced what we now face, applied their intelligence and civilization to the problem, and failed. The elder things in At the Mountains of Madness built a scientific civilization that mastered biological engineering and interstellar travel, yet they could not ultimately resist the forces they encountered, and eventually declined into extinction. The great race of Yith in The Shadow Out of Time, 1934-35, developed technology that allowed them to project their consciousness across time itself, possessing the bodies of beings in past and future eras to escape their own species' destruction. Yet even they live in terror of the flying polyps and other entities they cannot control. If civilizations vastly more advanced than ours, with sciences we cannot imagine and lifespans measured in geological epochs, ultimately failed to escape the cosmic forces Lovecraft describes, what hope does humanity have? The pre-human worshippers tell us not only that we are not first, but that being first offers no advantage, that intelligence and civilization are ultimately irrelevant variables in an equation whose outcome is predetermined by forces that consciousness cannot influence. This is cosmic determinism at its most nihilistic. Not that the universe is hostile, which would at least acknowledge us as enemies worth opposing, but that the universe operates according to patterns that render consciousness itself, human or non-human, ancient or modern, cosmically irrelevant. This leads to a final recognition that Lovecraft never explicitly articulates, but that his mythology systematically implies. The category of worship itself may be inadequate to describe what pre-human civilizations actually did in relation to entities like Cthulhu. Worship, as humans understand it, involves recognition of superior power combined with some expectation of relationship, however asymmetrical. We worship gods we believe can hear us, respond to us, care about us, even if only to punish us. The pre-human civilizations may have engaged in behaviors that superficially resemble worship, building temples, performing rituals, creating idols, but the underlying psychological reality might be something for which we lack concepts and vocabulary. Perhaps they were not worshipping, but documenting, creating records of encounters with entities whose existence threatened their sanity. Perhaps their temples were actually containment facilities, their rituals attempts at communication or negotiation rather than devotion. Perhaps what we interpret as religious architecture was actually scientific apparatus designed to study or channel forces they could perceive but not control. Lovecraft leaves these possibilities open, never definitively explaining what pre-human worship actually meant to the pre-human worshippers themselves, and this strategic ambiguity ensures that the horror remains philosophical rather than merely narrative. We are confronting not just the fact of pre-human civilizations, but the unbridgeable gap between their reality and our ability to comprehend it, and the disturbing possibility that our own religious impulses might be equally misunderstood by whatever consciousness arises after us to examine our ruins. Cthulhu himself occupies a carefully calibrated position in Lovecraft's cosmic hierarchy, and understanding this position is essential to grasping the full implications of pre-human worship. He is not the supreme entity in the mythos, but rather what we might call a priest entity, a being of immense power who nonetheless serves or relates to greater forces beyond him. In The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft describes him as the high priest of the great old ones, suggesting a religious structure that extends upward into domains even more incomprehensible than Cthulhu himself. This hierarchical arrangement is philosophically crucial because it means that the pre-human worshippers were not even addressing ultimate reality, but rather an intermediary, a translator of sorts between conscious beings and forces so alien that direct contact would be impossible. The worship patterns established millions of years ago were directed at a messenger, and the message itself, what the entities above Cthulhu actually want or are, remains forever obscured. This creates a nested structure of cosmic irrelevance. Humans worship. Cultists worship Cthulhu, worship something else, each layer more removed from genuine understanding than the last, like a game of telephone played across dimensional boundaries. The great old ones themselves, the collective term for entities like Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Azathoth, represent what Lovecraft termed a pantheon that came from the stars in various letters and stories, but they are not a pantheon in the traditional sense of cooperating deities with distinct portfolios and relationships. They are better understood as category errors, beings whose existence predates the categories of God, alien, or force of nature that we use to organize experience. Lovecraft deliberately keeps their origins vague. They come from the stars, or from beyond. They exist outside, or between normal space. They operate according to other geometries and alien mathematics. This systematic vagueness is not evasion, but philosophical precision. These entities cannot be explained using frameworks developed by human or even pre-human consciousness, because they existed before consciousness had evolved enough to create explanatory frameworks. The pre-human civilizations that worshipped them were attempting to relate to beings that existed prior to the evolution of relationship itself, which helps explain why their worship took forms that later humans find incomprehensible or disturbing when fragments of it are recovered through archaeology or dream visions. The elder things, sometimes called the old ones, not to be confused with the great old ones, provide the most detailed portrait of a pre-human civilization in Lovecraft's work, and they deserve careful attention because they represent consciousness at a scale that makes human civilization look ephemeral. Described in detail in At the Mountains of Madness, the elder things are portrayed as arriving on Earth approximately 1 billion years ago from interstellar space, establishing cities in what would eventually become Antarctica, and developing a scientific civilization that mastered biological engineering to such a degree that they created new life forms, including the Shoggoths, to serve as labor. Lovecraft describes them as radially symmetrical, barrel-shaped beings with multiple appendages and sensory organs, capable of surviving in extreme environments and possessing knowledge that included not only advanced sciences, but also awareness of the cosmic entities like Cthulhu that occupied other regions of Earth or the solar system. Their bas-reliefs, discovered and interpreted by the Antarctic expedition, depict their history. arrival, expansion, conflict with Cthulhu's starspawn for territorial control, eventual adaptation to changing planetary conditions, and slow decline as ice ages made their cities uninhabitable. What makes the Elder Things philosophically significant is that they possessed everything humans associate with advanced civilization: science, art, history, architecture, yet they still failed, still faced forces they could not control, and still left behind only ruins for later consciousnesses to misinterpret. The Deep Ones represent a different category of pre-human worshipper because they have not gone extinct, but persist into the modern era, creating a direct line of continuity between ancient worship and contemporary cult activity. Introduced in The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, the Deep Ones are amphibious beings that inhabit ocean depths and occasionally interbreed with human coastal populations, producing hybrid offspring that gradually transform from human appearance to Deep One physiology as they age. Lovecraft describes them as worshipping Cthulhu and Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, maintaining temples in underwater cities and conducting rituals that blend pre-human traditions with corrupted human religious forms. The horror of the Deep Ones is precisely their continuity. They bridge the gap between geological antiquity and the present day, suggesting that pre-human worship never actually ended, but merely moved to environments where humans rarely venture. When human cultists worship Cthulhu in Lovecraft's stories, they may be learning their rituals not from ancient texts alone, but from living pre-human beings who remember practices established millions of years ago and have kept them alive through direct tradition. This collapses the comfortable distance between past and present, suggesting that pre-human worship is not historical curiosity, but ongoing reality. The starspawn of Cthulhu occupy a particularly disturbing niche in the taxonomy of pre-human worshippers because they blur the boundary between worshipper and worshipped object. These entities, mentioned in At the Mountains of Madness and other texts, are described as having accompanied Cthulhu when he arrived on Earth from Zoth, or the stars, in the unimaginably distant past. They are sometimes depicted as his servants, sometimes as his offspring, sometimes simply as members of his species. Lovecraft never clarifies the relationship definitively. What we know from the Elder Things bas reliefs is that the starspawn engaged in territorial conflicts with the Elder Things for control of Earth, suggesting they possessed civilization and purpose of their own, yet they also seem to have participated in worship of Cthulhu or other entities themselves. This creates a recursive structure where worship extends both upward toward greater powers and downward toward lesser beings, with each entity in the hierarchy both venerating something above and being venerated by something below. The pre-human worshippers were not monolithic, but stratified, and human cultists who worship Cthulhu may simultaneously be following patterns established by the starspawn while themselves becoming objects of attention for entities below them in the cosmic hierarchy. The flying polyps introduced in The Shadow Out of Time provide a glimpse into pre-human civilizations that Lovecraft barely develops, but that imply terrifying possibilities. These entities existed on Earth 50 million years ago or earlier, possessing abilities that included partial invisibility and control over wind or air currents. The great race of Yith, themselves mind-swapping time travelers who possessed cone-shaped bodies during the Earth tenure, warred with the flying polyps, and ultimately imprisoned them in underground caverns using advanced technology. But the polyps were themselves builders of cities, practitioners of sciences, and potentially worshippers of entities that the great race's records describe only in fragments. What makes the flying polyps philosophically significant is that they represent worship by beings so alien that even Lovecraft's narrators struggle to describe them in concrete terms. If we accept that the elder things, despite their strangeness, were comprehensible as conscious beings with intelligible motivations, the flying polyps suggest a further remove, entities whose consciousness operated on principles so foreign that their worship practices would be unrecognizable even to other pre-human civilizations. The implication is that worship takes different forms, depending not just on culture, but on fundamental cognitive architecture, and that what humans call worship might bear no resemblance to what beings with radically different sensory and mental apparatus would do when confronting cosmic powers. We must recognize that Lovecraft deliberately avoids providing a complete taxonomy or timeline of pre-human worshippers, and this incompleteness serves important philosophical functions. Each story reveals fragments, a discovered city here, a translated manuscript there, a dream vision connecting disparate elements, but never the comprehensive picture. This mimics how historical knowledge actually accumulates, through incomplete evidence, contradictory sources, and ongoing reinterpretation. More significantly, it preserves mystery at the heart of the mythology. If we knew exactly which pre-human civilizations existed, in what order, with what relationships to each other and to the cosmic entities, the horror would diminish into mere alternative history. Instead, the gaps and ambiguities ensure that readers must construct their own mental models of pre-human worship, and these models will inevitably contain uncertainties that anxiety can exploit. Did the elder things worship Cthulhu, oppose him, or neither? Were the flying polyps and the star-spawn aware of each other? Do the deep ones remember specific rituals from their pre-human past, or are they improvising based on fragmentary memories? Lovecraft provides enough information to make these questions seem important, but not enough to answer them definitively, and this strategic withholding transforms pre-human worship from a background detail into an epistemological problem. We know it happened, we see its effects, but we cannot fully reconstruct it, and this gap between evidence and understanding generates the peculiar dread that characterizes cosmic horror at its most effective. The entities involved in pre-human worship collectively establish a crucial principle. Consciousness is common, civilizations are common, even worship is common across Earth's history, but mutual comprehension between different forms of consciousness is rare or impossible. The elder things could not fully understand Cthulhu's nature despite encountering him directly. The great race of Yith, with their ability to access minds across millions of years, still feared entities they could not analyze or predict. Human consciousness finds itself at the end of a long chain of partial comprehensions, attempting to worship entities that pre-human consciousnesses already failed to fully understand, using rituals whose original meanings were established by minds structured so differently from ours that translation becomes impossible. This is the final implication of examining the entities involved. Worship, across all its pre-human iterations, was always inadequate, always an approximation, always a conscious being's attempt to relate to something that consciousness itself was never equipped to process, and yet the worship continued, continues still, will continue after humanity ends, not because it achieves anything, but because encountering these entities produces worship as an automatic response, the way an eye produces tears when irritated, a reflex without purpose or hope of relief. Human encounters with evidence of pre-human worship in Lovecraft stories follow a consistent pattern: initial discovery, attempted interpretation through familiar frameworks, cognitive breakdown, and either madness or death. This is not arbitrary plotting, but a philosophical argument about the limits of human consciousness when confronted with realities that predate and exceed its evolutionary parameters. Consider the structure of the Call of Cthulhu, where knowledge accumulates through three distinct lines of investigation: a sculptor's nightmares during a global dream plague, an anthropologist's encounter with Louisiana cultists, and a sailor's accidental discovery of Relaya, and all three lines produce the same result: psychological collapse or violent death for those who investigate too deeply. Francis Wayland Thurston, the narrator who assembles these accounts after his uncle's suspicious death, recognizes the pattern explicitly, writing in his opening paragraph, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." This is not horror story rhetoric, but epistemological diagnosis. Human consciousness evolved to process certain scales and types of information, threats at human scale, relationships within human communities, causation operating across human timescales. When forced to process information about entities that operate at geological or cosmic scales, about worship practices established millions of years before human language existed, about geometries that violate the spatial intuitions built into human neurology, consciousness simply breaks. The role of artists and sensitives as involuntary receivers of pre-human knowledge deserves particular attention, because it suggests that contact with ancient worship does not occur only through archaeological discovery, but through direct psychic transmission. In The Call of Cthulhu, sculptors and poets across the world experience identical nightmares during February and March of 1925, producing artwork and writing that depicts Arlia and Cthulhu with remarkable consistency, despite having no contact with each other. Lovecraft implies that Cthulhu's stirring in his underwater tomb, triggered by temporary astronomical alignments or seismic activity, broadcasts psychic impressions that sensitive minds receive as dreams. This is worship operating in reverse, not conscious beings reaching out toward entities, but entities passively emanating their presence, which consciousness cannot help but register. The artists who experience these dreams do not understand what they are perceiving. Many describe them as nightmares of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks, or monstrous perversions of geometrical laws, but they feel compelled to record them, to translate them into human artistic forms. This creates a disturbing possibility that human art and religious imagery throughout history may contain unconscious reproductions of pre-human worship sites and entities, fragments of genuine cosmic horror, filtered through human aesthetics and misinterpreted as imagination or symbolic expression. The function of madness in Lovecraft's treatment of pre-human worship requires us to distinguish between madness as narrative convenience and madness as philosophical necessity. Many horror stories use insanity as a plot device. Characters go mad to prevent them from revealing crucial information or to create atmosphere. Lovecraft uses madness differently, as the inevitable result of consciousness encountering information it cannot integrate. When Professor Dyer and graduate student Danforth explore the Elder Things city in At the Mountains of Madness, Danforth looks back as they flee and sees something that breaks him. He shrieks about entities and vistas that should not exist, and after their rescue continues to babble about Yog-Sothoth and the Proto-Shoggoths in ways that suggest he perceived connections or realities that the narrative never explicates. This is not madness as loss of rational capacity, but madness as expansion beyond capacity. Danforth saw too much, understood too completely, and his consciousness could not accommodate the understanding without fragmenting. The implication is that sanity depends on ignorance, that human cognitive architecture requires us to not know certain things about the pre-human past and cosmic present in order to function. Madness becomes the price of genuine knowledge about realities that evolution did not prepare us to acknowledge. The bas-reliefs and idols that pre-human civilizations left behind function as what we might call recordings in non-human symbolic systems, attempts by non-human consciousness to encode information using visual languages that human consciousness can perceive but cannot fully decode. The Antarctic city in At the Mountains of Madness contains vast murals depicting the Elder Things' history, their arrival on Earth, their wars with the Starspawn, their creation of Shoggoths, their gradual decline. Professor Dyer spends considerable time examining and interpreting these bas-reliefs, using his archaeological training to extract historical information. But the narrative emphasizes that his interpretations are necessarily approximate, filtered through human assumptions about how to read visual narratives. The Elder Things' actual artistic conventions, their symbolic vocabularies, their methods of indicating chronology and causation, all of these remain partially opaque to human analysis. When human cultists create Cthulhu idols, they work from dreams and visions, producing crude approximations of something they have glimpsed but not fully seen. These human-made idols are copies of copies, degraded transmissions of original pre-human religious art that encoded information in proportions, angles, and material choices that humans perceive but cannot consciously process. Every attempt to reproduce pre-human worship through human craft introduces distortions, and these accumulated distortions create the peculiar sense that Lovecraft's cultists are performing cargo cult rituals, going through motions whose original meaning has been lost. We must consider carefully how Lovecraft frames human cult activity as fundamentally parasitic on pre-human worship rather than as independent religious innovation. The Louisiana cultists that Inspector Legrasse raids in 1908 described their traditions as handed down from the old ones, not as recently revealed or invented. The Innsmouth cultists in The Shadow over Innsmouth learned their worship from the Deep Ones, literally pre-human beings who remember practices from before human existence. Even the scholarly pursuit of forbidden knowledge through texts like the Necronomicon involves studying human attempts to describe pre-human realities, creating multiple layers of mediation between the reader and the actual worship practices. This structure serves to emphasize human belatedness. We are always arriving after the fact, attempting to reconstruct or reimagine worship patterns that were already ancient when our species emerged. Human religious innovation in this framework is impossible when it comes to the old ones. We can only rediscover, misinterpret, and incompletely perform rituals whose original meanings were established by beings whose consciousness operated under different principles. This inverts the usual narrative of religious history, where new revelations and prophetic insights mark progress toward deeper truth. Lovecraft's humans have no access to deeper truth because the deepest truths were articulated by pre-human consciousnesses, and what humans call revelation is actually faint, echo, or distorted memory. Dreams function as the primary mechanism through which pre-human worship leaks across temporal boundaries into human consciousness, and Lovecraft treats dreams not as mere symbols, but as actual perceptual access to realities normally blocked by waking consciousness's filters. The dream plague of 1925 in The Call of Cthulhu affects artists worldwide because, Lovecraft suggests, their creative sensitivities make them more permeable to psychic impressions that Cthulhu broadcasts from Aurelia. But these are not symbolic dreams requiring interpretation. They are literal visions of an actual sunken city and an actual entity. The dreamers paint and sculpt what they see with remarkable consistency because they are all seeing the same external reality through the medium of dreams. This implies that the boundary between dream and waking perception is not as absolute as humans assume, and that certain states of consciousness, artistic creation, madness, the transitional moments of falling asleep, allow perception of pre-human realities that waking rational consciousness blocks for its own protection. The pre-human worshippers may have possessed different relationships between waking and dreaming consciousness, may have been able to perceive Cthulhu and similar entities directly without requiring altered states. Human consciousness's need to relegate these perceptions to dreams indicates our cognitive weakness, our inability to process these realities while maintaining ordinary function. The phenomenon of inherited memory or racial memory appears throughout Lovecraft's treatment of human encounters with pre-human worship, suggesting that information about ancient practices might be encoded at biological levels below conscious access. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator discovers that his ancestry includes Deep One hybridization, and as this ancestry expresses itself through physical transformation, he finds himself instinctively drawn toward the ocean and toward worship practices he consciously rejects. This is not learned behavior, but genetic compulsion, suggesting that worship of the old ones operates at levels beneath culture or choice. If interbreeding between pre-human entities and humans can transmit worship tendencies biologically, then human religious impulses themselves become suspect. Are we worshiping through free choice or responding to genetic programming established when our ancestors encountered beings they could not resist? Lovecraft never fully develops this horrifying implication, but it lurks beneath many of his stories. The possibility that human consciousness is not author of its own devotions, but vessel for worship patterns seeded by pre-human contact millions of years ago, lying dormant in our biology until triggered by environmental conditions or conscious investigation into forbidden histories. This brings us to recognize that human interaction with pre-human worship across all of Lovecraft's stories is characterized by asymmetry and incomprehension. The pre-human civilizations encountered cosmic entities directly, developed responses to those entities over millions of years, created entire civilizations structured around those responses and left behind fragmentary evidence of their experiences. Humans encounter the evidence, misinterpret it through the lens of human categories and concerns, attempt to reconstruct worship practices they cannot truly understand, and suffer psychological consequences because human consciousness was never meant to process these realities. The madness that strikes Lovecraft's investigators is not punishment or supernatural curse, but natural consequence, the sound of consciousness exceeding its design parameters, like an engine redlining before it destroys itself. And yet, humans continue investigating, continue attempting to worship, continue excavating pre-human sites and translating pre-human texts, driven by curiosity or ambition or the psychic compulsions that Lovecraft only hints at. The function of madness, in this context, is both warning and inevitability. It tells us to stop, but it also tells us that we cannot stop, that consciousness confronted with evidence of its own cosmic irrelevance will continue investigating, even though investigation leads only to destruction. The pre-human worshippers at least had millions of years to develop their responses. Humanity has had mere thousands, and this temporal inequality ensures that our encounters with what they worshipped will always end in cognitive collapse. The concept of forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's mythology operates on a principle fundamentally different from religious or moral prohibitions against certain forms of inquiry. Knowledge is not forbidden because it violates divine law or corrupts the soul, but because human cognitive architecture cannot accommodate it without structural failure. When we learn that we are not the first conscious beings on Earth, that worship of cosmic entities predates our species by millions or billions of years, that our religious impulses are inherited rather than originated, the psychic infrastructure that organizes human experience, our sense of significance, our narratives of progress, our assumption of cosmic centrality, collapses under information it was never designed to process. This is what we might call epistemic collapse. Not simply learning disturbing facts, but learning facts that invalidate the categorical frameworks through which we organize and interpret all other facts. The pre-human worshippers function as the ultimate epistemic hazard because their existence proves that human civilization is neither first nor unique, and this proof undermines every consoling narrative we tell ourselves about why consciousness matters and history has meaning. The Necronomicon and Pnakotic manuscripts serve as the primary textual vectors for this epistemic collapse, and their function within Lovecraft's mythology deserves systematic analysis. The Necronomicon, supposedly compiled by Abdul al-Hazred around 730 CE, is described as a human attempt to systematize knowledge about the Old Ones, their history, and the rituals associated with their worship. But al-Hazred's sources, according to Lovecraft's scattered references, included pre-human texts, direct visions, and information gathered from entities or cults that preserved pre-human traditions. This makes the Necronomicon a translation of translations, a human interpretation of non-human knowledge, filtered through multiple layers of linguistic and conceptual mediation. The text's notorious effect on readers, madness being common among those who study it seriously, suggests that even this heavily mediated version of pre-human knowledge exceeds human processing capacity. The Pnakotic manuscripts represent an even more dangerous case because they supposedly originate directly with pre-human civilizations, containing knowledge recorded by non-human scribes for non-human readers. When human scholars encounter the Pnakotic manuscripts, they are attempting to read documents never intended for human comprehension, texts that assume cognitive categories and perceptual frameworks humans do not possess. The very act of translation becomes a form of cognitive violence, forcing human minds to stretch toward concepts they cannot properly grasp. We must recognize that the preservation of pre-human knowledge across geological timescales itself constitutes a form of horror in Lovecraft's framework. Information that should have been erased by time, by continental drift, ice ages, meteor impacts, species extinctions, persists through mechanisms that the stories describe but never fully explain. Sometimes knowledge is preserved in underground cities, protected from surface catastrophes. Sometimes it is recorded in material so durable that millions of years of erosion leave them largely intact. Sometimes it is transmitted psychically through dream visions or racial memories that bypass physical media entirely. This persistence suggests that the cosmos itself operates to ensure that certain knowledge remains accessible despite the passage of incomprehensible time. The implication is deeply unsettling. Perhaps pre-human worship knowledge survives not through accident, but through the intentional design of the entities being worshipped. Perhaps Cthulhu and the other old ones want consciousness, any consciousness, human or otherwise, to have access to information about how to worship them, about when they will return, about what configurations of stars and planets herald their awakening. Knowledge preserves itself because it serves purposes beyond human understanding, and human scholars who congratulate themselves on discovering ancient wisdom may actually be fulfilling roles in scripts written millions of years before human language existed. The phrase, "that is not dead, which can eternal lie," and with strange aeons, even death may die, encapsulates the ontological crisis that pre-human worship knowledge produces when humans encounter it. This couplet from the Necronomicon appears to be poetry, metaphor, or mystical utterance, categories through which humans naturally attempt to process disturbing claims. But Lovecraft's stories systematically literalize the statement. Cthulhu is not dead in any conventional sense, though he is also not alive in ways humans would recognize. He lies in Rilya, in a state that our categories of existence and non-existence cannot adequately capture. And when astronomical conditions align properly, strange aeons, he will resume activity, which the text describes as death dying, the category of death itself becoming invalid when applied to entities that exist outside temporal causation as humans understand it. This is forbidden knowledge, not because it is false, but because accepting its truth requires abandoning the ontological categories through which humans navigate reality. If death can die, then being and non-being are not opposite states, but phases in cycles we cannot perceive. If entities can be simultaneously dead and dreaming, then consciousness does not require life as we define it. The pre-human worshippers supposedly understood these concepts without the cognitive dissonance that shatters human minds, suggesting that their consciousness operated under different logical principles, and this possibility itself threatens human confidence in reason as a universal tool for understanding reality. The collapse of human exceptionalism stands as perhaps the most psychologically devastating consequence of encountering pre-human worship knowledge. Human cultures have constructed countless narratives that place humanity at the center of cosmic significance. Creation myths, that describe humans as the purpose of existence, theological frameworks that position human consciousness as the image of divine consciousness, scientific narratives that treat the evolution of human intelligence as the universe's way of understanding itself. Pre-human worship undermines all of these narratives simultaneously. If the elder things built cities when Earth was 1 billion years younger, if the great race of Yith mastered time travels 50 million years ago, if the deep ones have maintained continuous civilization longer than Homo sapiens has existed as a species, then human claims to centrality or uniqueness become absurd. We are not the universe's way of understanding itself, but merely the current iteration of consciousness on one planet, and previous iterations already worshipped entities we are only now encountering. This knowledge cannot be compartmentalized or relegated to academic curiosity because it invalidates the psychological infrastructure through which humans construct meaning and purpose. To truly accept that we are not first, not special, not even particularly significant in Earth's history, is to experience existence as fundamentally purposeless, and human consciousness, which evolved to detect patterns and assign meanings, cannot sustain itself in acknowledged purposelessness without fragmenting. Archaeological evidence that cannot be published without triggering civilizational despair represents the practical dimension of epistemic collapse. In At the Mountains of Madness, Professor Dyer explicitly states that he and Danforth have decided to dissuade future Antarctic expeditions through their narrative, even while knowing that their account will likely be dismissed as fantasy or madness. They possess photographs, biological specimens, and detailed maps that could verify their claims scientifically, yet they recognize that verification would be catastrophic. If the broader scientific community accepted that a non-human civilization built vast cities in Antarctica 1 billion years ago, that this civilization created life through biological engineering, that they warred with entities from the stars for territorial control of Earth, and that their murals depict cosmic histories that make human existence cosmically recent and insignificant, the psychological effects would destabilize human civilization, not because the information is inherently dangerous in a physical sense, but because it is dangerous in an epistemological sense. It destroys the narratives through which humans make existence tolerable. Dyer and Danforth choose strategic silence, knowing that some truths, even though verifiable, should remain unverified. This creates a horrifying closed loop. The evidence of pre-human worship exists and can be found, but those who find it recognize that sharing it would harm humanity more than concealing it, so they conceal it, ensuring that the next generation of investigators will have to rediscover it and reach the same devastating conclusions in isolation. We must confront the possibility that Lovecraft raises but never fully articulates, that human religious impulses themselves are symptoms of exposure to pre-human worship patterns, and that recognizing this would invalidate human spirituality entirely. If human cultists worship Cthulhu by unconsciously imitating pre-human rituals accessed through dreams or genetic memory, then what of other human religious behaviors? Are monotheistic devotions to Yahweh or Allah also unconscious imitations of pre-human relationships to cosmic entities? Are polytheistic pantheons corrupted memories of the elder things or other pre-human civilizations? Are mystical experiences of union with the divine actually psychic contact with entities like Yog-Sothoth that exist partially outside normal space-time? Lovecraft hints at these possibilities without confirming them, creating a paranoid hermeneutic where every human religious tradition becomes suspect, potentially traceable to pre-human origins we would rather not acknowledge. The epistemic collapse is complete when humans realize that even the impulse to resist these conclusions, to insist on the authenticity and autonomy of human spirituality, might itself be programmed, a defense mechanism that pre-human entities embedded in consciousness itself to ensure that worship patterns would persist, regardless of whether worshippers understood what they were doing or why. The final implication of forbidden knowledge about pre-human worship is that ignorance functions as a survival strategy for consciousness itself. Lovecraft's stories consistently suggest that the universe operates according to principles that conscious beings, human or otherwise, are better off not understanding. The pre-human civilizations that did understand, that encountered cosmic entities directly and developed comprehensive knowledge about them, all eventually fell into extinction or decline. Perhaps knowledge itself is causally dangerous, not through supernatural curse, but through natural consequence. Understanding that consciousness is cosmically irrelevant makes it harder for consciousness to maintain itself, creates selection pressure against awareness, ensures that the beings most likely to survive are those too ignorant to recognize their own insignificance. Humans evolved to be just intelligent enough to develop technology and civilization, but not intelligent enough to perceive cosmic realities directly, and the occasional human who, through scholarship or psychic sensitivity, breaches this protective ignorance goes mad because their consciousness attempts operations it cannot sustain. The pre-human worshippers, despite their vastly longer civilizational durations and more advanced sciences, could not escape this trap. They knew more than humans currently know, and that knowledge contributed to their failure. We are protected by stupidity, and every attempt to overcome that stupidity through investigation of pre-human worship brings us closer to the epistemic collapse that ended our predecessors. This is the ultimate forbidden knowledge. That knowledge itself forbids us, that understanding the cosmos accurately is incompatible with continuing to exist within it. The concept of pre-human worship did not emerge fully formed in The Call of Cthulhu, but developed gradually across Lovecraft's earlier stories, each adding layers to what would become his systematic vision of civilizations that predated humanity. The Nameless City, written in January 1921 and published in The Wolverine that November, presents Lovecraft's first sustained treatment of a pre-human civilization discovered through archaeological investigation. The story's narrator, exploring ruins beneath the Arabian desert, discovers a city built on a scale suggesting its architects were reptilian creatures far smaller than humans, with architecture too low for a human occupant, and passageways that force him to crawl. The narrator describes finding endless galleries of painted walls, depicting the history of these reptilian beings, showing their civilization at its height and their gradual decline into degeneracy as changing planetary conditions made surface life impossible. What makes this story foundational for the pre-human worship concept is its establishment of a pattern, non-human consciousness that arose, built civilization, created religious or cultural practices, and then declined so completely that later humans encounter only ruins whose purpose and meaning remain opaque despite extensive evidence. Dagon, written in July 1917 and published in The Vagrant in November 1919, provides an even earlier prototype for the discovery of pre-human worship sites, though Lovecraft had not yet developed the philosophical framework that would make such discoveries cosmically significant rather than merely exotic. The story's narrator, a merchant marine officer, finds himself stranded on a section of ocean floor unexpectedly exposed by seismic activity during World War I. He discovers a massive monolith covered with carvings depicting humanoid but non-human beings engaged in what appear to be ritual activities, and he witnesses a creature of enormous size emerging from the water to approach the monolith in what the narrator interprets as worship or reverence. The story concludes with the narrator's psychological breakdown and his conviction that the entity he witnessed will eventually find him. What Dagon establishes is the oceanic dimension of pre-human worship, the idea that the depths harbor not only unknown creatures, but evidence of civilizations and religious practices that flourished when the current continents were configured differently or did not exist at all. This becomes crucial for the Call of Cthulhu, where R'lyeh rises from the Pacific depths, suggesting that ocean floors preserve pre-human worship sites that continental surfaces have long since eroded away. The festival, written in October 1923 and published in Weird Tales in January 1925, introduces the concept of worship traditions that predate human settlement of specific regions, though the story remains ambiguous about whether the worshippers themselves are human or something else. The narrator travels to Kingsport, Massachusetts for a family reunion during Christmas, only to discover that his relatives participate in subterranean rituals involving entities that are described ambiguously. They may be humans who have become something other through their worship, or they may be non-human beings that his human ancestors joined in worship practices established before colonial settlement. The story references the Necronomicon for the first time in Lovecraft's published work, establishing it as a text that documents worship practices of extreme antiquity. The crucial innovation here is the suggestion that New England, Lovecraft's familiar geographic territory, contains worship sites and practices that vastly predate Puritan colonization or even Native American habitation, implying that pre-human worship can be discovered not only in exotic locations like Arabia or the Pacific, but in one's own ancestral homeland, undermining the assumption that familiar places are thoroughly known and safe. The publication of The Call of Cthulhu in the February 1928 issue of Weird Tales represents the crystallization of these scattered elements into a comprehensive system. The story's three-part structure, The Horror in Clay, 1925, Dream Plague and Sculptor's Breakdown; The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, 1908, Louisiana Cult Raid and Scholarly Investigation; and The Madness from the Sea, 1925, Encounter with Risen R'lyeh, creates a narrative architecture that demonstrates how evidence of pre-human worship accumulates across different investigative methods and geographic locations until a coherent but horrifying picture emerges. Inspector Legrasse's raid on the Louisiana swamp cult produces captured cultists who describe their worship of Cthulhu as traditions handed down from eons before man existed, using the phrase Finglui Mgurunaf, Cthulhu R'lyeh Gahnagel Vtagen, which they cannot fully translate or explain. When Professor Webb of Princeton examines the Cthulhu idol seized in the raid, he discovers hieroglyphics that resemble no known writing system, suggesting pre-human authorship. The parallel investigation by Thurston's late uncle, Professor Angel, reveals that during February and March 1925, artists worldwide experienced identical nightmares depicting a great cyclopean city of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths. And these dreams coincided precisely with when Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen's ship accidentally discovered Rolia, risen temporarily from the ocean, and encountered Cthulhu himself. This intertextual architecture, where different stories reference the same entities, texts, and worship practices, creates what literary theorists call a shared universe, but with a crucial difference from typical franchise world-building. Lovecraft was not creating a consistent setting for adventure stories, but rather constructing a false archaeology, a network of cross-references designed to produce the effect of documentary corroboration. When The Dunwich Horror, 1928, references the Necronomicon and describes pre-human entities breeding with humans to produce hybrid offspring, it corroborates the possibility raised in The Festival that worship traditions blur the boundary between human and non-human participants. When The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, introduces the Mygo, a fungoid race from Yugoth, Pluto, and describes their presence on Earth. Since the Jurassic period, it expands the temporal and biological range of pre-human consciousness that has encountered and potentially worshipped cosmic entities. Each new story adds data points that retrospectively enrich earlier stories, creating the sense that Lovecraft is gradually uncovering a reality that exists independent of any single narrative, rather than inventing as he goes. The collaborative dimension deserves particular attention because it transformed Lovecraft's personal mythology into something approximating a genuinely shared cultural artifact. When Robert E. Howard incorporated references to the Black Stone and the Unersprechlichen Kulten, a forbidden text invented by Robert Bloch, in his 1931 story, The Black Stone, he was depicting pre-human worship in prehistoric Europe, suggesting that every continent contains evidence of civilizations that predated Homo sapiens. Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean stories, set in a fictional prehistoric civilization in northern regions of Earth, depicted human cultures both literally on top of pre-human cities, with the humans occasionally discovering artifacts and texts from the earlier inhabitants. These cross-pollinations, writers borrowing each other's invented entities, texts, and historical frameworks, created a mythology that seemed to exist independently of its creators, as if multiple authors were documenting different aspects of a single underlying reality rather than coordinating fictional inventions. This technique would later be formalized in role-playing games and encyclopedic reference works, but its origin lies in the 1920s and 1930s correspondence and collaborative spirit of the Weird Tales Circle. We must recognize that these earliest appearances and intertextual connections established the foundational principle that would govern all subsequent Lovecraft scholarship and adaptation, that the Cthulhu mythos, a term Lovecraft himself never used, coined later by August Derleth, possessed internal consistency and could be treated as a historical, mythological system subject to analysis, expansion, and systematization. Whether Lovecraft intended this level of consistency remains debated. His letters suggest both careful world-building and casual improvisation, depending on which correspondence one examines. But the effect was to create a body of work that invited readers to become investigators themselves, tracking references across stories, constructing timelines of pre-human civilizations, mapping the relationships between different entities and texts. the pre-human worshippers became not just narrative elements, but research subjects. And this transformation from fiction to pseudo-scholarship represents Lovecraft's most profound influence on the horror genre. Subsequent writers would not simply write more Cthulhu stories, but would treat his mythology as a discovered artifact requiring careful study and interpretation. And this approach has persisted for nearly a century, generating libraries of analysis, speculation, and expansion around the question of who worshipped cosmic entities before humans existed, and what traces of that worship remain for us to discover, or to be destroyed by discovering. At the Mountains of Madness, written in February and March of 1931, and eventually published in Astounding Stories in 1936, represents Lovecraft's most comprehensive and detailed treatment of pre-human civilization, providing what amounts to a natural history of non-human intelligence on Earth across 1 billion years. The story takes the form of a scientific report by Professor William Dyer of Miskatonic University, who participated in an Antarctic expedition during the 1930-1931 season and discovered a vast ruined city built by beings he calls the Elder Things, or Old Ones. The narrative's scholarly frame, complete with references to geological strata, paleontological specimens, and photographic evidence, creates maximum documentary effect, presenting pre-human civilization not as mystical speculation, but as empirical discovery that any future expedition could verify. Dyer's explicit purpose in writing the account is to dissuade future Antarctic exploration, warning that certain regions contain knowledge humanity is better off not pursuing, which transforms the narrative from an adventure story into a document of epistemic warning. The story thus operates simultaneously as adventure narrative, scientific report, and philosophical argument about the limits of beneficial knowledge. The Elder Things arrive on Earth approximately 1 billion years ago, descending from interstellar space to establish settlements in what would eventually become Antarctica, but was then positioned differently due to continental drift. Lovecraft describes them through Dyer's examination of perfectly preserved specimens discovered in ice. Barrel-shaped beings, approximately 8 feet tall, with radially symmetrical anatomy, featuring 5 ridged starfish-like appendages at each end of the cylindrical body, along with tentacles, respiratory apparatus, and sensory organs, arranged in patterns suggesting consciousness, fundamentally different from vertebrate organization. These beings possess sophisticated sciences, having mastered biological engineering to such a degree that they created new life forms, most significantly the Shoggoths, amorphous protoplasmic entities designed as multi-purpose labor organisms capable of forming temporary specialized organs as needed for specific tasks. The discovery of these specimens forces Dyer and his colleague Danforth to confront the reality that intelligent technological civilization existed on Earth hundreds of millions of years before even the earliest vertebrates, let alone primates or humans, rendering human self-importance cosmically absurd. The careful biological detail Lovecraft provides, the description of cellular structure, reproductive methods, and evolutionary adaptations, creates scientific verisimilitude that makes the philosophical implications more devastating. The vast city itself functions as a 3-dimensional archive of pre-human history, its bas-reliefs depicting the Elder Things' entire tenure on Earth in sequential narratives that Dyer and Danforth painstakingly examine and interpret. The murals show the Elder Things' arrival and initial establishment of settlements, their conflicts with other entities, including the star spawn of Cthulhu, who arrived from space at a later date and established their own territorial claims in the Pacific region, the development of complex civilization, including cities, sciences, arts, and what Dyer carefully describes as religious or superstitious practices, without fully committing to either interpretation. One crucial mural depicts the Old One's discovery of formless protoplasm already present on Earth when they arrived, which they shaped into multicellular life forms, including plants and animals, the implication being that the entire biosphere, including the evolutionary line that eventually produced humans, originates from elder things, biological engineering experiments. This revelation strikes at the heart of human exceptionalism from yet another angle. Not only did intelligent civilization exist before us, but our very existence as biological organisms traces back to their deliberate manipulations of terrestrial life, making humanity not just cosmically insignificant, but literally a byproduct of pre-human scientific projects. The story's treatment of worship becomes most explicit in the murals depicting conflicts between the Elder Things and Cthulhu's star spawn. Lovecraft, through Dyer's narration, describes bas reliefs showing terrible stone tentacled heads and entities that match descriptions from the Necronomicon and other forbidden texts, confirming that these texts preserve genuine information about pre-human conflicts. The Elder Things apparently regarded Cthulhu and his spawn as rivals rather than objects of worship. They fought territorial wars for control of Earth's surface and oceans, eventually driving the star spawn back to their stronghold in Arlier before that city sank beneath the Pacific. But other murals suggest the Elder Things themselves encountered entities they could not comprehend or control, beings from other dimensions or outer abysses that prompted responses Dyer interprets as potentially religious or worshipful, though he admits the alien symbolism makes definitive interpretation impossible. This creates a hierarchy of cosmic horror. The Elder Things, themselves incomprehensible to humans, encountered entities incomprehensible even to them, suggesting layers of cosmic reality extending outward and upward beyond any possibility of complete understanding by consciousness at any level. The Shoggoth's rebellion represents another dimension of pre-human history, with disturbing implications for worship and servitude. These artificially created organisms, designed as mindless protoplasmic labor, gradually developed rudimentary consciousness and intelligence through natural selection. The Elder Things bred them for increased complexity and capability, not recognizing that complexity would eventually produce autonomous thought. The Shoggoths began to resist their creators, imitating the Elder Things' behaviors, including, potentially, their worship practices or religious rituals, though whether this imitation represented genuine understanding or mere mimicry remains unclear. Eventually, the Shoggoths stage outright rebellions that the Elder Things barely suppressed through advanced weaponry. When Dyer and Danforth flee the city in the story's climax, they are pursued by a Shoggoth that has survived into the present era, a blind protoplasmic mass that nevertheless exhibits behaviors suggesting it remembers or instinctively performs actions it observed millions of years ago. The Shoggoth's existence raises a horrifying possibility that worship or ritual behavior, once established, can persist across geological time through biological inheritance or behavioral conditioning, continuing even after the entities being worshipped are gone and the worshippers no longer understand what they are doing. The story's conclusion, with Danforth's psychic breakdown and cryptic utterances about Yog-Sothoth and entities beyond the mountain peaks, suggests that the pre-human history revealed through the murals is itself incomplete. Danforth glances backward as they flee and sees something that breaks his mind, something the narrative never reveals to readers, preserving mystery at the story's core, despite its unprecedented detail about pre-human civilization. His mad babbling includes references to entities and concepts not depicted in the Elder Things murals, suggesting he perceived connections or realities that even the billion-year-old bas-reliefs did not capture. This narrative technique, providing extensive detail while preserving a core of inexplicable horror, demonstrates Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding that cosmic horror requires both specificity and obscurity. The Elder Things history is detailed enough to seem real, and their civilization comprehensible enough to facilitate comparison with human civilization. But the entities they encountered and the ultimate fate that befell them remain partially obscured, ensuring that documentary precision cannot fully dispel existential dread. At the Mountains of Madness establishes several principles that would govern subsequent treatments of pre-human worship in Lovecraft-influenced fiction. First, pre-human civilizations possess sufficient detail and internal consistency to seem scientifically plausible despite their impossibility. Second, these civilizations did not simply exist, but left comprehensive records of their histories, making discovery of pre-human worship a matter of archaeological excavation rather than mystical revelation. Third, the worship practices of pre-human beings remain partially opaque to human interpretation even when extensive evidence exists, suggesting that consciousness itself varies enough across species that complete mutual comprehension is impossible. Fourth, learning about pre-human civilization produces psychological effects in human investigators that range from existential despair to total madness, indicating that this knowledge is inherently dangerous regardless of how it is acquired. Fifth, and perhaps most disturbing, pre-human histories reveal that even vastly advanced civilizations eventually failed when confronted with cosmic forces they could neither understand nor control, suggesting that intelligence and technology provide no ultimate protection against cosmic indifference. These principles, established most completely in At the Mountains of Madness, provided the template that later writers and adapters would follow when expanding the mythology of pre-human worship, creating a legacy that extends far beyond Lovecraft's original 35,000-word narrative into virtually every subsequent treatment of cosmic horror's temporal and civilizational dimensions. The Shadow, Out of Time, written between November 1934 and February 1935 and published in Astounding Stories in June 1936, presents Lovecraft's most philosophically sophisticated treatment of pre-human consciousness and the transmission of knowledge across geological epochs. The story's narrator, Nathaniel Wingate Peasley, is an economics professor at Miskatonic University who in 1908 experiences a sudden personality change, losing all memory of his previous life and exhibiting knowledge and behaviors completely inconsistent with his former self. After 5 years, his original personality returns with no memory of the intervening period, but with persistent dreams, suggesting his consciousness was displaced to another body in Earth's distant past, specifically to a cone-shaped organism belonging to the great race of Yith, who inhabited Earth approximately 150 million years ago. The narrative structure creates a sophisticated game of verification and doubt. Peaslee must determine whether his dreams represent genuine memories of temporal displacement or elaborate delusions produced by mental illness, and the story provides just enough corroboration to make both interpretations plausible while refusing to definitively endorse either. This epistemological uncertainty elevates the shadow out of time, beyond adventure narrative, into philosophical investigation of consciousness, identity, and the reliability of memory when confronted with experiences that should be impossible. The great race of Yith represents Lovecraft's most radical conception of pre-human intelligence because they are not merely ancient but temporally mobile. Their civilization's survival strategy involves projecting consciousness across time to possess the bodies of beings in other epochs when their current bodies face extinction. Peaslee's dreams, which he eventually verifies through independent archaeological evidence, describe a civilization of cone-shaped beings approximately 10 feet tall, with 4 flexible appendages, 2 ending in claws for manipulation, 1 bearing sensory organs, and 1 equipped with organs for communication through clicking and scraping sounds. These beings built vast cities in what would eventually become Australia, establishing a society devoted primarily to knowledge preservation. Their central project was constructing a massive library containing the complete history of intelligent life on Earth and beyond, records captured by projecting Yithian consciousness into minds across millions of years, experiencing those minds' lives, and then documenting what they learned before returning to their original time. This creates a disturbing model of scholarship as temporal imperialism. The great race preserved knowledge by essentially kidnapping consciousness from across Earth's history, trapping those displaced minds in Yithian bodies while Yithian minds inhabited theirs, extracting information and then reversing the exchange. The library itself functions as the ultimate archive of pre-human worship, containing records from civilizations separated by millions of years that never had physical contact, but whose knowledge the Yithians gathered and organized. Peaslee describes vast halls filled with cases containing books, tablets, and recording devices of incomprehensible variety, some made from terrestrial materials, others from substances suggesting extraterrestrial origin. The books are written in languages spanning Earth's entire history of conscious life. In dreaming, I saw that many of these had been in my own hands, and in my altered consciousness, I had read and even written some of them. I had studied their terrible pictorial and ideographic secrets, and had added to certain ones a second section in my own alien hieroglyphs. This is knowledge preservation taken to its logical extreme, a library where every text humanity has produced or will produce already exists alongside texts from beings that existed before humans and will exist after humans, all catalogued and cross-referenced by minds that perceive time non-linearly. The pre-human worship practices of dozens of species are supposedly documented in this library, making it the ultimate forbidden repository. If it could be accessed, humanity would gain complete knowledge of every civilization that ever worshipped cosmic entities, but that knowledge would necessarily include awareness of humanity's cosmic insignificance. The story's treatment of worship becomes explicit in Peaslee's descriptions of what the Yithian library contains regarding entities like Cthulhu and other old ones. He recalls reading texts that described the space beings whose advent to the planet was so early, and the various pre-human and non-human races that encountered these beings. There were hints of the coming of the spawn of Cthulhu in millions of years back in the Paleozoic age, and of the struggles for supremacy between them and the elder things that had come to Earth from the stars 1 billion years before. The library contains primary sources from these conflicts, texts written by participants rather than later historians, making it the only place where pre-human worship could be understood from the perspective of the actual pre-human worshippers. Peaslee also describes sealed vaults in the lowest levels of the library, containing knowledge considered dangerous even by the great race, texts and artifacts that document entities or forces that the Yithians themselves feared. This creates a hierarchy of epistemic danger. If the beings capable of time travel and consciousness swapping across millions of years still recognized certain knowledge as too dangerous to freely access, what does that suggest about the cosmic realities that knowledge describes? The flying polyps represent the limit of even Yithian mastery, demonstrating that pre-human civilizations, regardless of their technological sophistication, still faced entities they could not fully comprehend or control. These beings, described as partially invisible, capable of controlling wind and air currents, and possessing geometries that violated Euclidean space, warred with the great race throughout their tenure on Earth. The Yithians eventually developed weapons that allowed them to imprison the polyps in underground caverns sealed by complex technologies, but they lived in constant fear that the seals would fail and the polyps would escape. Peaslee's dreams include encounters with these imprisoned entities, described in terms that emphasize their fundamental alienness. They are not simply hostile, but ontologically incompatible with consciousness as the Yithians or humans understand it. The question of whether the flying polyps themselves worshipped cosmic entities or whether they were themselves objects of worship for other species remains deliberately unclear. This ambiguity is crucial because it suggests that worship relationships among pre-human beings operated under rules and dynamics that human categories of worshipper and worshipped cannot adequately capture. The story's climax involves Peaslee's 1935 participation in an Australian archaeological expedition that discovers ruins matching his dreams. Massive underground structures of basalt blocks, hieroglyphics in the Yithian script he remembers from his displacement, and eventually his discovery of specific documentation proving his consciousness was indeed displaced to a Yithian body 150 million years ago. He finds a book he himself wrote during his time in the Yithian body, a text in English describing human history from his original 1908-1913 perspective, preserved alongside texts in dozens of other languages from dozens of other displaced minds. This verification transforms the entire narrative from possible delusion to confirmed reality within the story's internal logic, forcing readers to accept that consciousness can be displaced across time, that pre-human civilizations documented these displacements, and that their libraries continue to exist beneath the earth, waiting for human excavation. The final horror comes when Peaslee realizes that certain sections of the underground complex show recent activity, footprints and disturbances, suggesting that something, possibly the flying polyps that the Yithians imprisoned, may have escaped and still inhabits the ruins. The Shadow, Out of Time, establishes several innovations in the literary treatment of pre-human worship that extend beyond Lovecraft's other work. First, it presents consciousness itself as potentially transhistorical. Minds from different epochs can directly encounter each other through temporal displacement rather than only learning about each other through archaeological remnants. Second, it suggests that complete documentation of pre-human worship exists and could theoretically be accessed, transforming the question from "what did they worship?" to "do we dare read what they recorded about their worship?" Third, it demonstrates that even civilizations with godlike capabilities, time travel, consciousness projection, million-year institutional continuity, still face entities they cannot master and forces they cannot understand, suggesting that the cosmic horror hierarchy extends infinitely upward beyond any finite intelligence's capacity to navigate. Fourth, it makes verification of pre-human civilization's existence surprisingly straightforward. Peaslee finds physical proof, photographs it, brings colleagues who confirm his findings. Yet this verification produces no reassurance, only deeper dread as the implications of confirmed pre-human knowledge sink in. Finally, and most disturbingly, it suggests that humanity's future history may already be documented in Yethian libraries, that beings 150 million years ago already knew what would happen to human civilization because they projected their consciousness forward into human bodies in our future, experienced that future, and recorded it before we live it. This creates a deterministic nightmare where even human religious and cultural developments, including any worship of cosmic entities we might engage in, are merely fulfilling patterns already observed and catalogued by pre-human archivists who regard us not as autonomous agents, but as temporary hosts for their consciousness-gathering expeditions across time. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythology, beginning in the 1940s after Lovecraft's 1937 death, represents both the most influential and most controversial expansion of pre-human worship concepts. Derleth, who founded Arkham House, publishing specifically to preserve Lovecraft's work, took the scattered references and ambiguous hierarchies in Lovecraft's stories and imposed a coherent theological structure modeled on Christian dualism. He divided the cosmic entities into elder gods, benevolent beings analogous to angels, and old ones, malevolent beings analogous to demons, with pre-human civilizations supposedly caught between these warring factions. This systematization fundamentally misrepresents Lovecraft's philosophical vision, which emphasized cosmic indifference rather than cosmic conflict between good and evil. Where Lovecraft's entities exist beyond human moral categories, neither good nor evil, but simply operating according to alien purposes, Derleth's framework reasserts anthropocentric morality at cosmic scale. Despite this philosophical betrayal, Derleth's systematization proved enormously influential because it made the mythology more accessible and gameable. His timeline placing the elder thing's arrival at specific dates, his identification of which pre-human races worshipped which entities, his creation of a cosmic war narrative with clear sides and stakes, all of these provided structure that later writers, game designers, and encyclopedists would adopt, modify, and expand. Robert Bloch's contributions to the pre-human worship mythology deserve recognition for maintaining Lovecraft's original ambiguity while expanding the geographical and temporal range of ancient civilizations. In stories like The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, and The Shadow from the Steeple, 1950, Block depicted pre-human or proto-human cults that bridged the gap between genuinely non-human civilizations and human worship traditions. His invention of the De Vermis Mysteries, a forbidden text supposedly written by Ludwig Prynne in the 15th century, provided another vector through which pre-human knowledge could reach human consciousness. Bloch's approach suggested that human medieval occultists had independently rediscovered and documented worship practices whose origins lay in pre-human traditions, creating chains of transmission that made pre-human worship feel less archaeologically remote and more immediately threatening. His characterization of cults as continuous organizations persisting across centuries, rather than as repeatedly rediscovered worship patterns, added an element of intentional preservation to the mythology. The suggestion that human cultists actively worked to maintain pre-human traditions rather than accidentally stumbling upon them. Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean cycle, set in a fictional prehistoric human civilization that flourished before the last ice age, explored the concept of human cultures literally built atop pre-human worship sites. Stories like The Tale of Satampra Zeros, 1929, and The Door to Saturn, 1930, depicted Hyperborean cities where residents occasionally discovered sealed chambers or subterranean passages containing artifacts from earlier inhabitants. The Vormis, a race of proto-human or non-human beings who worshipped Tsathoggua, an entity Smith created but which Lovecraft adopted into his own stories. This layering of civilizations created a vertical archaeology of worship. Dig beneath Hyperborean temples and find Vormis shrines. Dig beneath those and potentially find even earlier worship sites from species that left no name. Smith's prose style, more ornate and decadent than Lovecraft's, treated pre-human worship aesthetically rather than philosophically, as an opportunity for Baroque description of alien architecture and elaborate ritual rather than as existential crisis. This divergence demonstrates how collaborative myth-building allowed different authors to emphasize different aspects of shared concepts, with Smith focusing on sensory richness and dark beauty, where Lovecraft emphasized cognitive horror and cosmic meaninglessness. Ramsey Campbell's early Lovecraft pastiches, written as a teenager in the late 1950s and revised for publication in the 1960s, relocated pre-human worship to Britain's Severn Valley, creating a geography of cosmic horror in the English countryside that paralleled Lovecraft's New England settings. Stories like The Moon Lens, 1964, and Cold Print, 1969, depicted ancient worship sites in locations thoroughly mapped and settled by modern civilization, suggesting that pre-human temples might exist beneath churches, shopping centers, or suburban homes. This urbanization of cosmic horror made pre-human worship feel more immediately proximate, not something requiring Antarctic expeditions or deep-sea exploration, but potentially accessible through basement excavations or countryside wandering. Campbell's approach influenced later British weird fiction significantly, establishing that cosmic horror's temporal and civilizational dimensions could be explored within familiar domestic spaces rather than requiring exotic locales. The philosophical implication was that pre-human worship had occurred everywhere on Earth, not just in remote regions, making it impossible to identify safe zones untouched by ancient presences. The Chaosium Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981 and still actively supported as of 2025, represents the most comprehensive systematization of pre-human worship for practical, rather than literary purposes. Game designer Sandy Peterson and subsequent contributors created detailed timelines, statistics, and descriptions for the Elder Things, the Great Race of Yith, the Flying Polyps, the Serpent People of Volusia, and numerous other pre-human civilizations, making them into playable elements within the game's investigative horror framework. This required stripping away much of Lovecraft's intentional ambiguity. Game mechanics demand specificity about capabilities, chronology, and motivations that Lovecraft deliberately avoided providing. The game's influential supplement, Masks of Nyarlathotep, 1984, included a global campaign where investigators discover pre-human worship sites on multiple continents, each adapted to local geography and archaeology, creating what amounts to a world atlas of ancient cult activity. While this gamification necessarily reduces philosophical horror to tactical challenges and psychological collapse to numerical statistics, it also introduced millions of players to the core concepts of pre-human worship, making Lovecraft's obscure pulp fiction stories into widely recognized cultural touchstones. Thomas Ligotti's philosophical horror fiction, particularly stories collected in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1989, and Grimscribe, 1991, represents a literary heir to Lovecraft's treatment of pre-human consciousness that emphasizes the phenomenological and existential dimensions over archaeological detail. Ligotti's stories rarely feature literal pre-human civilizations, but instead explore the psychological state of characters who recognize consciousness itself as aberrant, existence as nightmare, and human purposes as arbitrary impositions on meaningless void. This can be read as extrapolating Lovecraft's implications to their logical conclusion. If pre-human civilizations discovered that consciousness brings only suffering when confronted with cosmic reality, then consciousness itself, not specific cosmic entities, becomes the source of horror. Ligotti's influence on contemporary weird fiction has been to shift emphasis from external threats, cosmic entities, pre-human worship, to internal horror, the structure of consciousness itself as trap. This represents a philosophical development of Lovecraft's themes, even while abandoning much of his mythological apparatus, suggesting that the most profound implications of pre-human worship may be phenomenological rather than historical. China Miéville's Bas Lag trilogy, particularly Perdido Street Station, 2000, and his story, Details, 2002, demonstrate how contemporary weird fiction engages with Lovecraftian pre-human civilization themes while rejecting Lovecraft's reactionary politics and stylistic limitations. Miéville's worlds feature multiple non-human intelligent species coexisting with humans and each other, creating present-tense versions of what Lovecraft relegated to the distant past. The implication being that consciousness takes many forms simultaneously rather than sequentially. His treatment of ancient civilizations like the Ghosthead Empire in the Baslag novels depicts societies that combined magic and technology in ways that make modern civilization look crude, yet they collapsed for reasons that remain archaeologically unclear, leaving behind artifacts that current inhabitants use without understanding. This updates Lovecraft's pre-human worship concept for a post-colonial context, questioning assumptions about civilizational progress and suggesting that multiple valid forms of consciousness and culture can coexist without any possessing ontological primacy. Miéville's academic background in international relations and his Marxist political commitments produce a version of cosmic horror where the horror stems not from non-human consciousness itself, but from structures of power and exploitation that operate across species boundaries. The proliferation of online collaborative fiction projects, particularly the SCP Foundation Wiki, founded 2008, demonstrates how digital culture has adopted and transformed Lovecraft's pre-human worship mythology into crowdsourced world-building. SCP entries like SCP-2000, a facility that has repeatedly rebuilt human civilization after apocalyptic collapses, implying we may not be the first iteration of Homo sapiens, and SCP-1730, remains of a facility from an alternate timeline where humanity was destroyed, create recursive variations on Lovecraft's temporal horror. The SCP format, clinical documentation of anomalous objects and entities written in bureaucratic rather than literary prose, updates Lovecraft's pseudo-academic style for contemporary readers more familiar with wikis and databases than with 1930s pulp fiction. The collaborative nature of SCP writing, where hundreds of authors contribute to a shared universe with loose editorial oversight, resembles the Lovecraft Circle's collaborative myth building, but operates at vastly larger scale and speed. This has produced thousands of entries exploring variations on pre-human consciousness, ancient worship, and civilizations that preceded or will succeed humanity, making Lovecraft's specific mythology just one reference point among many in a vast ecosystem of cosmic horror concepts. The democratization of myth-making that digital platforms enable ensures that pre-human worship, as a narrative and philosophical device, will continue evolving in directions Lovecraft could never have anticipated, each new iteration both honoring and transforming the original vision in response to contemporary anxieties about technology, environment, and humanity's place in an increasingly incomprehensible world. The bleeding of Lovecraft's fictional archaeology into actual pseudo-archaeological discourse represents one of the most fascinating cultural afterlives of the pre-human worship concept, demonstrating how literary inventions can migrate into belief systems when they articulate anxieties that factual frameworks struggle to address. The phenomenon accelerated in the 1960s and 1970s when writers like Erich von Däniken popularized ancient astronaut theories through books like Chariots of the Gods, 1968, arguing that prehistoric monuments like the pyramids or Nazca lines could only have been constructed with extraterrestrial assistance. While von Däniken never explicitly referenced Lovecraft, the underlying structure mirrors the pre-human worship mythology precisely. Advanced non-human intelligences visited Earth in the distant past, interacted with primitive humans or pre-human civilizations, and left behind archaeological evidence that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. The emotional appeal is identical. The suggestion that official narratives conceal earth-shattering truths about humanity's origins and cosmic context. Online communities dedicated to ancient mysteries routinely blur Lovecraftian fiction with genuine archaeological anomalies, treating the Necronomicon and the Piri race map as equivalent categories of suppressed knowledge, despite one being explicitly invented and the other being a real 16th century document whose significance is wildly exaggerated. The Bimini Road controversy exemplifies how natural geological formations become reinterpreted as pre-human construction when filtered through expectations shaped by cosmic horror narratives. Discovered in 1968 off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, this underwater rock formation consists of rectangular limestone blocks that appear artificially arranged, leading some researchers to claim it represents ruins from Atlantis or another prehistoric civilization. Mainstream geologists have demonstrated repeatedly that the formation results from natural fracturing of beach rock, but the alternative interpretation persists in popular consciousness because it fulfills narrative expectations established by stories like The Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness, the expectation that ocean floors conceal cyclopean ruins from civilizations that flourished when continental configurations differed from present arrangements. The Bimini Road has become a pilgrimage site for those seeking tangible evidence of pre-human or antediluvian civilization, with diving tours marketed specifically to mystery hunters who want to experience the frisson of potentially encountering proof that mainstream archaeology dismisses. This demonstrates how Lovecraft's literary techniques, the detailed description of sunken cities, the insistence that scientific orthodoxy suppresses inconvenient truths, have created interpretive frameworks that people apply to actual geographical features, producing belief in pre-human civilization independent of any actual evidence. The proliferation of forged artifacts claiming pre-human origin reveals the psychological need for material proof of ancient mysteries that written accounts alone cannot satisfy. The Eltdown shards, a deliberate hoax I reference here as representative of a broader category rather than a specific historical fraud, exemplify how certain collectors and amateur archaeologists have attempted to create physical evidence for Lovecraftian concepts. These forgeries typically combine plausible elements, ancient-looking stone or metal, with impossible ones, inscriptions in languages that resemble Lovecraft's invented scripts, or impossible radiocarbon dates. The forgers are often not cynical con artists, but true believers who feel that creating evidence serves a higher truth, that pre-human civilizations existed, and if physical proof has not survived geological time naturally, then producing it artificially merely illustrates what must have once existed. This logic reveals an important psychological mechanism. When narratives feel true at an emotional or philosophical level, some individuals will work backward to create evidence that supports the narrative, reversing the normal epistemological relationship between evidence and conclusion. The forgeries function as what we might call props for belief, objects that allow abstract cosmic horror concepts to be handled, photographed, and displayed, transforming literary philosophy into quasi-religious material culture. Online communities dedicated to decoding ancient structures as worship sites for cosmic entities represent the democratization of Lovecraftian archaeology through digital platforms. Forums and YouTube channels devoted to alternative archaeology regularly reinterpret megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunku, or the Moai of Easter Island as temples built by or for non-human intelligences. The analytical method resembles literary close reading applied to physical structures, identifying geometric patterns supposedly too precise for prehistoric human technology, noting astronomical alignments that might indicate communication with non-terrestrial entities, discovering iconographic elements that supposedly reference the old ones when properly interpreted. These analyses typically ignore archaeological context, dating methods, and indigenous cultural explanations in favor of cosmic horror interpretations that cast ancient peoples as either pre-human species or humans who encountered pre-human knowledge. The discourse employs pseudo-academic language borrowed from both archaeology and Lovecraft scholarship, creating hybrid texts that read like archaeological papers about fictional entities. This represents a significant cultural shift from earlier generations of Lovecraft readers who maintained clearer boundaries between fiction and reality. Contemporary digital culture enables communities where those boundaries blur productively, allowing participants to engage in collaborative world building that treats pre-human civilizations as simultaneously fictional for legal and social acceptability, and potentially real for emotional and philosophical investment. The psychological appeal of pre-human worship, hoaxes, and misinterpretations requires us to consider what needs these beliefs fulfill that conventional, historical, and archaeological frameworks do not. Mainstream science tells us that human civilization is approximately 10,000 years old, that previous hominid species existed but did not develop complex civilizations, and that Earth's history involves long periods where only non-conscious or minimally conscious life existed. This narrative positions humanity as genuinely first, the planet's first experiment with technological civilization, the first time matter has organized itself into something capable of comprehending the cosmos. For many, this narrative proves psychologically unsatisfying, despite being well evidenced, because it makes human existence feel random and contingent rather than part of a larger pattern. Pre-human worship narratives, whether Lovecraft's or pseudo-archaeological variations, provide an alternative that feels more meaningful precisely because it suggests humanity is not first. If others came before and also sought meaning through worship, if cosmic entities have been encountered repeatedly by different forms of consciousness, then human religious impulses are not arbitrary cultural inventions, but responses to genuine cosmic presences. The hoaxes and misinterpretations in this light function as attempts to impose meaningful pattern on history, even if that pattern is horrifying rather than comforting. We must recognize that the most disturbing aspect of pre-human worship, hoaxes, is not their falsity, but their plausibility within Lovecraft's fictional framework. If pre-human civilizations existed millions or billions of years ago, as Lovecraft's stories claim, then geological processes would have erased almost all evidence. The absence of proof becomes, in this logic, exactly what we should expect. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when dealing with timescales that dwarf human comprehension. This creates an unfalsifiable belief system where every failed search for pre-human artifacts is reinterpreted as evidence of how thoroughly time has concealed the truth, and every ambiguous geological formation becomes potentially significant. The Lovecraftian framework thus provides believers with interpretive tools that can survive indefinitely despite contradicting all empirical evidence, because it defines pre-human civilization specifically as that which leaves no reliable evidence. The hoaxes, myths, and misinterpretations surrounding pre-human worship should therefore be understood not as simple failures of critical thinking, but as expressions of a deeper psychological need, the need to believe that human meaning-making, including worship, connects to something larger and older than our species, even if that something regards us with complete indifference. The proliferation of these alternative archaeologies in the internet age suggests that Lovecraft's vision has become a folk epistemology for those dissatisfied with mainstream scientific narratives but unable to accept traditional religious explanations. Pre-human worship occupies a conceptual space between atheistic materialism, which offers no cosmic meaning, and theistic faith, which demands belief in benevolent purpose. It acknowledges that gods or godlike beings might exist while denying that they care about humanity, and it validates religious impulses while suggesting they arise from encounters with real cosmic entities rather than cultural inventions or divine revelation. This middle position appeals to those who find scientific materialism emotionally barren, but religious orthodoxy intellectually untenable, offering a third option that feels both more realistic than traditional religion and more meaningful than pure materialism. The fact that this third option is explicitly fictional in origin does not diminish its psychological utility. In an age where boundaries between fiction and reality blur continuously through digital media, narrative truth and factual truth become increasingly difficult to distinguish, and Lovecraft's pre-human worship mythology thrives in exactly this ambiguous epistemological territory. The 2005 silent film adaptation of The Call of Cthulhu, produced by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society and directed by Andrew Lehman, represents a paradoxical approach to filming pre-human worship, using obsolete cinematic technology to depict impossibly ancient subject matter. Shot in black and white with deliberate grain, artificial aging, and intertitle cards mimicking 1920s cinema, the film treats Lovecraft's 1926 story as if it were being adapted during the year of its writing rather than nearly 80 years later. This stylistic choice proves philosophically appropriate because it emphasizes temporal distance. We are watching a document from the past, depicting events from the incomprehensibly distant past, creating nested layers of retrospection. The film's depiction of Relia rising from the Pacific employs miniatures and forced perspective rather than digital effects, making the Cyclopean city look simultaneously magnificent and artificial, like a prop that should not exist in three-dimensional space. This aesthetic choice captures something essential about pre-human worship. It looks wrong, geometrically impossible, as if it were constructed according to spatial principles that physical reality should not permit. The film's cult following demonstrates that audiences can appreciate cosmic horror through deliberate archism, that making the film itself feel ancient creates tonal alignment with subject matter about worship practices older than human memory. Underwater, a 2020 film directed by William Eubank, relocates pre-human worship to deep-sea drilling facilities, updating Lovecraft's ocean horror for an era of environmental crisis. The film follows researchers in a subterranean facility who discover that their drilling has disturbed a vast ecosystem of creatures living in oceanic trenches, creatures that may be the deep ones or related species maintaining ancient worship sites. The climax reveals these creatures surrounding and apparently venerating a massive entity resembling Cthulhu, suggesting that pre-human worship continues in ocean depths, uninterrupted by surface civilizations. What makes Underwater philosophically relevant is its implication that human industrial activity, drilling for resources with no regard for what exists in previously inaccessible depths, accidentally breaches barriers that pre-human worshippers established millions of years ago. The film treats corporate resource extraction as archaeological excavation without proper precautions, suggesting that capitalism's drive to exploit every environment inevitably leads to encountering what should remain undisturbed. The pre-human worship in Underwater is not historical curiosity, but ongoing reality that human activity threatens to interrupt or unleash, transforming Lovecraft's temporal horror into environmental warning about the consequences of treating Earth as inexhaustible resource rather than habitat shared with forces we cannot comprehend. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, while not explicitly Lovecraftian, explores pre-human or non-human consciousness through its depiction of an alien presence that rewrites biology at genetic level, creating what characters call the shimmer, a zone where Earth's familiar life forms mutate into configurations that follow different organizational principles. The film's treatment of the alien as simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, creating art-like patterns in its mutations while destroying individual identity and autonomy, parallels Lovecraft's suggestion that pre-human civilizations operated under aesthetic and organizational principles fundamentally alien to human perception. The alien in Annihilation does not worship anything, but it produces what we might interpret as worship-like behaviors in the organisms it transforms, patterns of movement, architectural structures, and biological configurations that suggest intentionality without comprehensible purpose. This represents an evolution of Lovecraft's pre-human worship concept. What if consciousness itself, when it emerges under different conditions or constraints, naturally produces behaviors that resemble worship, but serve functions we cannot recognize because we assume all purposeful behavior must be interpretable through human categories? The Call of Cthulhu, role-playing games' influence on video game adaptations, demonstrates how interactive media transforms pre-human worship from object of investigation to space of exploration. Games like Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, allow players to experience multiple time periods across 2 millennia, discovering that each era contains cultists worshipping the same entities, creating a playable version of Lovecraft's temporal layering. The game's sanity meter mechanic, where encountering cosmic horror degrades the player character's mental stability, producing gameplay effects that blur the boundary between fiction and reality, gamifies Lovecraft's concept that pre-human knowledge inherently damages human consciousness. More recently, Bloodborne 2015 presents chalice dungeons beneath the game's gothic city, procedurally generated labyrinths that extend impossibly deep and contain architecture and enemies that predate the surface civilization. These dungeons function as playable pre-human worship sites, spaces where players literally descend through layers of historical accumulation to encounter entities that existed before the game's surface world was built. The game never explains who originally constructed the chalice dungeons or what their purpose was, preserving Lovecraftian ambiguity while allowing players direct spatial experience of the temporal vertigo that reading at the Mountains of Madness produces textually. Musical engagements with pre-human worship cluster primarily in extreme metal and dark ambient genres, forms that emphasize atmosphere and conceptual depth over conventional song structures. The death metal band Nile's album Amongst the Catacombs of Neferenka, 1998, combines Egyptian archaeology with Lovecraftian themes, depicting ancient Egyptian cults as the latest iteration of worship practices established by pre-human civilizations who occupied the Nile Valley millions of years earlier. The technical complexity of death metal, blast beats, multi-layered guitar work, vocals that sound inhuman, provides sonic analogs for the conceptual complexity and alien nature of pre-human consciousness. Cryochamber's dark ambient compilations, particularly Cthulhu 2014 and Azathoth 2015, use drones, field recordings, and heavily processed sounds to create what the label describes as soundscapes of ancient temples, attempting to produce auditory experiences of spaces built by and for non-human worship. These compositions often extend for 30 minutes or more without conventional development or resolution, creating temporal experiences that mirror the geological timescales Lovecraft invokes. Listening becomes an endurance exercise where normal musical expectations, verse, chorus, climax, are deliberately frustrated, forcing listeners into passive reception of ambient sound that may or may not contain intentional patterns. Metallica's instrumental, The Call of Cthulhu, a 1984, deserves mention as one of the earliest mainstream musical engagements with Lovecraftian themes, demonstrating how pre-human worship concepts could be translated into progressive metal structures. The 8-minute instrumental builds through multiple sections, using tempo changes and dynamic shifts to create narrative movement without lyrics, suggesting that the cosmic horror Lovecraft describes might be more effectively communicated through pure sound than through words. The choice to make the piece instrumental implies that pre-human worship and cosmic entities exist beyond language, that attempting to verbalize them necessarily fails, and that music's abstract nature makes it potentially more adequate to the task. This represents a sophisticated understanding of Lovecraft's philosophical project. If pre-human worship operated outside human linguistic categories, then artistic responses that abandon language entirely might achieve greater fidelity to the source material than literary adaptations that must use words to describe what supposedly exceeds verbal description. The persistence of pre-human worship themes across film, games, and music suggests these concepts fulfill specific artistic functions that written fiction alone cannot provide. Film offers visual realization of the cyclopean architecture and non-Euclidean geometries that Lovecraft describes verbally, forcing directors and production designers to make concrete what the text leaves imaginative. Games provide spatial navigation and embodied experience of pre-human sites, transforming readers into explorers who descend through temporal layers physically rather than conceptually. Music offers temporal and atmospheric experiences that mirror the slow, crushing weight of geological time and cosmic indifference that Lovecraft's prose evokes. Each medium emphasizes different aspects of the pre-human worship concept. Film's visual impossibility, games' explorable depth, music's wordless dread, and their combined effect has been to make Lovecraft's literary inventions feel like a multimedia mythology that exists across platforms rather than originating in pulp fiction stories. This cross-platform proliferation ensures that new generations encounter pre-human worship through media native to their era, rather than requiring archaeological excavation of 1920s and 1930s magazines, ironically making the ancient feel contemporary, while the contemporary adaptations gesture back toward incomprehensible antiquity. The result is a cultural feedback loop, where each new adaptation teaches audiences how to recognize Lovecraftian themes in subsequent works, creating a self-perpetuating system of reference and homage that grows increasingly distant from Lovecraft's original texts while claiming to honor their vision. The emergence of Lovecraft studies as a legitimate academic field during the 1980s and 1990s transformed pre-human worship from pulp fiction device into object of serious scholarly analysis, with critics examining how Lovecraft's mythology engages with modernist anxieties about time, identity, and epistemology. S.T. Joshi's definitive biography, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, and his critical study, The Weird Tale, 1990, established frameworks for analyzing Lovecraft as a sophisticated philosophical writer rather than merely a genre craftsman, arguing that stories like At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time constitute serious engagements with early 20th century scientific and philosophical developments. Academic conferences devoted to weird fiction now regularly feature panels on Lovecraft's treatment of deep time, non-human consciousness, and the epistemological implications of pre-human knowledge. This scholarly legitimation has paradoxical effects. It validates treating Lovecraft's work as intellectually substantial, but it also domesticates cosmic horror by subjecting it to the same analytical frameworks used for canonical literature, potentially neutralizing the very strangeness that makes the pre-human worship concept philosophically powerful. When pre-human civilizations become dissertation topics, they lose some capacity to disturb, transformed from existential threats into objects of professional knowledge production. The new weird literary movement, emerging in the 1990s and crystallizing in the early 2000s through writers like China Miéville, Jeff Vandermeer, and K.J. Bishop, appropriated Lovecraft's pre-human civilization concepts while explicitly rejecting his reactionary politics and stylistic conservatism. These writers maintained Lovecraft's fascination with non-human consciousness and ancient civilizations, but situated them in urban environments, post-colonial contexts, and politically progressive frameworks. Miéville's Perdido Street Station, 2000, presents a city where multiple intelligent species coexist, including the Khepri, scarab-headed beings, and the Cactucae, plant-based humanoids, making the multi-species civilizations that Lovecraft relegated to the distant past into present-tense political realities. The novel's archaeological references to the ancient Ghosthead Empire, a civilization that mastered reality-manipulating mathematics before mysteriously collapsing, update Lovecraft's pre-human worship for readers skeptical of cosmic pessimism, but interested in how power and knowledge operate across species and temporal boundaries. The new weird's appropriation demonstrates that Lovecraft's formal innovations, ancient non-human civilizations, worship of incomprehensible entities, knowledge is danger, can be separated from his ideological commitments: racism, cultural conservatism, species hierarchy, allowing contemporary writers to explore cosmic horror's philosophical implications without endorsing its original author's prejudices. Object-oriented ontology, OO, a philosophical movement associated with thinkers like Graham Harman, Timothy Morton, and Levi Bryant, has embraced Lovecraft as an unlikely philosophical precursor, arguing that his fiction dramatizes key OO principles about the autonomy and inscrutability of objects. Harman's essay On the Horror of Phenomenology, 2008, and his book Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, argue that Lovecraft's entities and pre-human civilizations represent what philosophy calls withdrawal, the principle that objects always exceed any relation to them, that Cthulhu, or the elder things, possess realities independent of human perception or knowledge. This philosophical appropriation treats pre-human worship as illustrating how consciousness, rather than being privileged access to reality, is merely one mode of relation among many, and not necessarily the most important. The great race of Yith's ability to project consciousness across time in this reading demonstrates that mind is not special or exempt from the material processes that govern all entities. This represents a radical reinterpretation, where Lovecraft's stories express horror at humanity's cosmic insignificance. O philosophy celebrates that insignificance as liberation from anthropocentrism. The pre-human worshippers, from this perspective, are not terrifying evidence of human irrelevance, but welcome proof that consciousness has always been one phenomenon among many rather than the universe's telos or purpose. The speculative realism movement in continental philosophy, which includes but extends beyond OO, has similarly adopted Lovecraft as a resource for thinking beyond correlationism. Quentin Meillassoux' term for philosophy's tendency to assume that reality is always reality for consciousness, rather than reality independent of any observer. Eugene Thacker's trilogy, In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, Starry Speculative Corpse, 2015, and Tentacles Longer Than Night, 2015, explicitly engages Lovecraft alongside medieval mysticism and contemporary horror to develop what Thacker calls the horror of philosophy, the recognition that the world exceeds any capacity of thought to comprehend it. Thacker treats pre-human worship in Lovecraft as dramatizing philosophy's nightmare, that rigorous thinking, if pursued far enough, reveals the inadequacy of thinking itself. The pre-human civilizations thought deeply, developed sciences far beyond ours, documented their knowledge comprehensively, and still failed to master or understand the cosmic forces they encountered. This suggests that intelligence, regardless of degree, faces inherent limits, that some aspects of reality remain forever withdrawn from consciousness. Thacker's appropriation of Lovecraft for philosophical purposes demonstrates how cosmic horror's literary devices can function as thought experiments about the limits of knowledge, making pre-human worship relevant not just to horror fans, but to anyone concerned with epistemology and metaphysics. The deep time humanities, an emerging interdisciplinary field, examining humanity's place in geological and cosmic timescales, has found Lovecraft's pre-human civilizations surprisingly relevant to contemporary environmental and existential anxieties. Scholars like Dipesh Chakrabarti in The Climate of History, 4 Theses, 2009, and Timothy Clark in Eco-Criticism on the Edge, 2015, argue that the Anthropocene, the current geological epoch defined by human impact on planetary systems, requires us to think across timescales that exceed human intuition or historical memory, precisely the temporal vertigo that Lovecraft's fiction induces. When climate scientists discuss feedback loops that operate across centuries or millennia, or when geologists date rock formations to billions of years before present, they are asking us to comprehend durations for which human consciousness has no evolved framework. Lovecraft's pre-human civilizations provide narrative structures for processing this cognitive challenge. If we imagine the elder things arriving on Earth 1 billion years ago, we are practicing the kind of temporal thinking that understanding geological deep time requires. The fact that this practice emerges from horror fiction rather than scientific pedagogy suggests that narrative and affect, story, and feeling may be more effective tools for comprehending incomprehensible scale than abstract numerical representations. The Internet horror community, particularly the SCP Foundation Collaborative Writing Project, represents perhaps the most extensive subcultural appropriation of Lovecraft's pre-human worship concepts, transforming them into a continuously expanding wiki-based mythology. Founded in 2008 on 4chan and migrating to its own wiki, the SCP Foundation presents itself as documentation from a secret organization that contains and studies anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena. Multiple SCP entries explicitly engage pre-human civilization themes. SCP-2000 describes a facility designed to rebuild human civilization after extinction events, with evidence suggesting it has been used multiple times already. SCP-1730 documents remains from an alternate timeline where humanity was destroyed. SCP-1000 reveals that Bigfoot-like creatures represent survivors of a species that dominated Earth before humans and was deliberately reduced to remnant populations by humanity's ancestors through what amounts to genocide. These entries update Lovecraft's pre-human worship for a generation raised on internet creepypasta, Wikipedia aesthetics, and collaborative world-building, creating what amounts to a post-Lovecraftian mythology where the anxiety is not that pre-human civilizations existed, but that we might be living in their ruins without recognizing it, or that we might ourselves be the pre-human civilization from the perspective of whatever consciousness emerges after us. The academic and subcultural appropriations of pre-human worship collectively demonstrate that Lovecraft's concepts possess surprising philosophical durability and adaptability. They can be analyzed through scholarly frameworks that Lovecraft never encountered: post-colonial theory, object-oriented ontology, environmental humanities, without losing their disturbing power. They can be rewritten to challenge rather than reinforce the prejudices embedded in the original stories, making cosmic horror compatible with progressive politics. They can migrate from literary fiction to philosophical argument to collaborative internet projects, accumulating new meanings and contexts while retaining core elements. The temporal vertigo of geological deep time, the cognitive inadequacy of consciousness when confronted with realities it did not evolve to process, the disturbing possibility that worship and meaning-making are not uniquely human, but repeatedly emerging patterns that consciousness produces regardless of species or epoch. This adaptability suggests that pre-human worship functions less as a specific set of narrative claims about fictional elder things or great races, and more as a structure for thinking about humanity's temporal and cosmic position, a structure flexible enough to accommodate scientific discoveries Lovecraft never anticipated, philosophical movements that emerged after his death, and cultural anxieties he could not have foreseen. The subcultural and academic afterlife of these concepts indicates they have transcended their pulp fiction origins to become genuine contributions to how contemporary culture processes questions about consciousness, time, meaning, and the possibility or impossibility of significance in a cosmos that predates us by billions of years and will persist long after we end. The Anthropocene presents a strange reversal of Lovecraft's pre-human worship narrative. Humanity has become a geological force capable of leaving traces in the fossil record that future observers millions of years hence could detect and study, transforming us from cosmically insignificant into literally world-changing. Yet this reversal produces anxiety rather than reassurance, because the mechanisms through which we have achieved geological significance, industrial extraction, atmospheric alteration, mass extinction of other species, mirror the hubris that Lovecraft's pre-human civilizations displayed before their collapse. The elder things engineered life, reshaped ecosystems, and built cities across continents. Yet they still faced forces they could neither comprehend nor control. eventually declining into extinction as planetary conditions shifted. Climate scientists increasingly describe feedback loops and tipping points in language that echoes Lovecraft's fatalism, processes we have initiated but can no longer halt, consequences that will unfold across timescales, exceeding political or even civilizational attention spans, forces we have awakened that operate according to their own logic without regard for human intentions. The pre-human worship mythology thus becomes relevant, not as cautionary tale about discovering ancient knowledge, but as mirror reflecting our own position. We too worship forces we do not fully understand. Economic growth, technological progress, resource extraction, and future intelligences examining our ruins may puzzle over why we maintained these worship patterns even as they led toward our decline. Artificial intelligence and the prospect of post-human consciousness introduce another dimension to pre-human worship's contemporary relevance. If we succeed in creating digital intelligences that surpass human cognitive capabilities, or if we augment human consciousness through biotechnology or brain-computer interfaces to the point where the result can no longer be called simply human, then future consciousness examining our era will recognize us as the pre-human civilization from their perspective. The transition from human to post-human intelligence would replay the pattern Lovecraft describes: one form of consciousness, building civilization, developing knowledge systems, perhaps worshipping or relating to cosmic forces according to its specific cognitive architecture, then being succeeded by a different form of consciousness that encounters the predecessor's ruins and attempts to reconstruct their purposes and meanings. The disquieting implication is that we are already potentially pre-human from the perspective of intelligences that do not yet exist, but that our technological trajectory makes increasingly probable. Our worship practices, our philosophical systems, our scientific knowledge, all of these might appear as opaque and alien to post-human consciousness, as the elder things, bas-reliefs, appear to Lovecraft's human investigators. This suggests that the pre-human category is not historical but relational. Any consciousness that succeeds another becomes the post-human relative to its predecessor, and every civilization is potentially pre-human from the perspective of what comes after. The Fermi paradox, the apparent contradiction between high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations and complete absence of evidence for them, takes on darker implications when filtered through Lovecraft's pre-human worship framework. The paradox asks, if the universe is vast and old, and if technological civilizations should be common, why have we detected no signs of them? Standard solutions propose that civilizations inevitably self-destruct, or that they exist, but communication across interstellar distances proves impossible, or that we are genuinely alone. Lovecraft's mythology suggests a more disturbing possibility, that the universe contains civilizations, but they are here, beneath, in forms we do not recognize as civilization because they operate under principles and purposes so alien that our attempts to detect or communicate with them systematically fail. The deep ones in this reading are not fictional, but representative of the actual nature of non-human intelligence. Beings that coexist with us spatially, but not conceptually, that maintain their own cultures and perhaps worship practices in environments or dimensions we rarely access. The absence of radio signals from other stars might not indicate absence of intelligence, but rather that intelligence, when it emerges under different conditions, does not produce radio astronomy, does not announce itself through electromagnetic broadcasts, does not seek contact with other consciousness, because its purposes and perceptions differ so fundamentally from ours that mutual comprehension is impossible even when physical proximity exists. Extinction studies, the interdisciplinary field examining species loss, civilizational collapse, and the psychology of acknowledging decline, finds uncomfortable resonance with Lovecraft's treatment of pre-human civilizations as case studies in inevitable failure. The field emerged in response to accelerating biodiversity loss and growing recognition that human civilization may be approaching inflection points beyond which current social structures cannot be maintained. Scholars like Roy Scranton in Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, 2015, and Jem Bendell in Deep Adaptation, 2018, argue that preparing for civilizational collapse requires psychological work analogous to preparing for personal death, accepting that what we have known will end, that efforts to prevent ending may prove futile, and that meaning must be found in context of acknowledged finitude. This parallels how Lovecraft's human investigators must psychologically process the discovery that pre-human civilizations, despite their vastly superior sciences and million-year durations, still faced extinction. The pre-human worshippers tell us that longevity offers no security, that technological advancement does not equal escape velocity from cosmic indifference, and that consciousness, regardless of form or capability, participates in cycles of emergence and extinction that no intelligence has successfully transcended. Extinction studies and cosmic horror thus converge on the same psychological territory. How does consciousness maintain purpose when confronted with high probability evidence of its own eventual ending? The concept of temporal nihilism, despair arising specifically from recognition of cosmic timescales rather than from absence of intrinsic meaning, represents perhaps the most acute philosophical danger that pre-human worship concepts pose. Existential philosophy traditionally addresses what we might call synchronic meaninglessness, the absence of inherent purpose at any given moment. Sartre, Camus, and other existentialists argued that humans could create meaning through authentic choice and action despite this absence. Temporal nihilism introduces a diachronic dimension. Even if we successfully create meaning in the present, the geological record shows that all previous meaning creation projects have ended in extinction and erasure, and the same fate awaits ours. The pre-human civilizations worshipped their entities for millions of years, yet their worship ended when they ended, and the entities they worshipped remain as indifferent to their absence as they were to their presence. This suggests that meaning creation itself, rather than solving the problem of meaninglessness, might merely postpone recognizing its inevitability. The fact that humans persist in creating meaning despite this recognition, we build, write, love, worship, knowing that geological time will erase it all, could be interpreted either as heroic defiance or as cognitive failure, inability to fully integrate knowledge that would prevent functioning if truly accepted. Lovecraft's pre-human worshippers provide evidence for the latter interpretation. Perhaps consciousness cannot survive complete acceptance of cosmic meaninglessness. Perhaps some level of denial or compartmentalization is psychologically necessary, and perhaps the madness that strikes Lovecraft's investigators represents what happens when denial fails. We must confront a final, deeply unsettling possibility that Lovecraft hints at, but never fully articulates, that human worship practices, including contemporary religious behaviors, might themselves be cargo cult reenactments of pre-human worship patterns, passed down through mechanisms we do not understand and directed toward entities whose nature we have forgotten. If the deep ones can interbreed with humans and transmit worship tendencies biologically, as the shadow over Innsmouth suggests, then what percentage of human religious behavior traces to such contamination? If dreams can transmit knowledge of Religia and Cthulhu across individuals who have never communicated, as the call of Cthulhu demonstrates, then how many human religious visions represent genuine psychic contact with entities that pre-human civilizations also encountered? If texts like the narcotic manuscripts preserve pre-human knowledge and occasionally surface in human cultures, then how much of human theology derives from studying documents never meant for human comprehension? This line of thinking threatens to invalidate all human religious experience by reframing it as second-hand, imitative, and directed toward entities that do not reciprocate or possibly even notice the worship. The enduring power of pre-human worship as a concept is that it makes this threat feel plausible, not because evidence supports it, but because the structure of the argument exploits real uncertainties about consciousness, memory, and cultural transmission that science has not yet fully explained. The persistence of Lovecraft's pre-human worship concepts across nearly a century, their proliferation across media and subcultures, and their appropriation by academic philosophy all point toward an uncomfortable conclusion. These ideas endure because they articulate anxieties that contemporary culture produces but struggles to address through conventional frameworks. We live in an age of deep time awareness, confronting geological and cosmic scales through climate science and cosmology. We face potential post-human transitions through artificial intelligence and biotechnology. We witness mass extinction and civilizational instability, suggesting our own culture might be temporary. We discover exoplanets by the thousands, making the absence of detected alien civilizations more rather than less puzzling. Pre-human worship mythology provides narrative structures for processing these anxieties, stories that make incomprehensible timescales feel tangible, that dramatize consciousness's limitations, that imagine what succession might look like, that offer explanations, however disturbing, for cosmic silence. The concepts persist, not because they are true, but because they are useful, providing emotional and philosophical frameworks for experiences that factual disciplines describe accurately but do not render psychologically manageable. Whether this utility justifies their continued cultural reproduction, or whether we should resist narratives that normalize despair and cosmic insignificance, remains an open question. What seems certain is that as long as human consciousness must confront its position in deep time and cosmic space, something like Lovecraft's pre-human worship mythology will remain relevant, not as literal history, but as emotional topology, mapping the psychological terrain that awareness of our temporal and spatial context produces, and perhaps offering strategies, however bleak, for continuing to function despite knowing what we know about how small and recent and temporary we are.